Good evening. Come in, get comfortable, and let the day end. Whatever today was for you, long, loud, disappointing, or simply very ordinary, it's finished with you now. It doesn't get to follow you in here. For the next few hours, there's nothing for you to solve, nothing to carry, nothing to be. Let your breathing slow down. Let the room drift a little further away. Tonight, the story is Harry Potter's. The whole of it, beginning to end. Not only the parts everyone remembers, but the full shape of a life. The November night his parents died, and the love that saved him. The letters that came and came until they poured down the chimney in their thousands. The castle. The two friends who quietly became his family. The teacher who hated him for reasons he wouldn't understand for 17 years. The war that came for him anyway. The walk into a dark forest to die. And the plain, peaceful life that was waiting on the other side of all of it. We'll go slowly, a year at a time, from the cupboard under the stairs to the very last page. And none of it needs to be remembered. There's nothing here to keep. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle of a Quidditch match, or halfway down a corridor on the 7th floor, then this did exactly what it came to do. The story is only the boat. Sleep is the shore. If these long, slow stories are the ones that finally get you under, a subscribe keeps them coming, night after night. That's the only thing I'll ask of you, and I won't mention it again. So let your head get heavy. Let your shoulders come down. They've been up all day, and they're allowed to stop now. You don't need to listen closely, or follow, or stay awake for me. My voice will simply keep going, low and even and unhurried, and you can hold on to the words or let them blur into the dark. Either one is fine. They both end in the same place. We begin then, not with the boy and not with the scar, but with a tidy, unremarkable street on a cold evening in November. Neat houses, neat hedges, neat little lives, where nothing strange had ever happened and everyone preferred it that way. Somewhere far from that street, a war had just ended that night, and on one of those perfectly ordinary doorsteps, in the small dark hours before dawn, someone was about to leave a sleeping baby with nothing but a letter. So, the street, the hedges clipped to the same height all the way along, the cars sleeping at the curb, the lamps still burning at 4 a.m, and nobody at all awake to see them. The bundle of blankets on the step, and the letter tucked in beside it. Before we set him down there, though, before we let the door close on the 10 years that follow, we should go back one night, and a few 100 miles west, to a village where the story really begins, because the child on that step had a home once, and it was only a day old in the past, and it was warm. The village was called Godric's Hollow, and on the last night of October, it had the look of any small place that takes its holidays seriously. There were carved pumpkins on the windowsills, with candles guttering inside them, and children being walked home through the damp, and the war memorial in the square, standing quiet under a sky that had cleared after rain. In a house at the end of the lane there was a young man and a young woman, both 21, which is very young indeed to have been at war for as long as they had, and their son, who was 15 months old and had just discovered how funny it was to be lifted into the air. They had been hidden for months. They had been hidden by a spell so old and so clever that no one could find them unless one particular friend chose to say the words aloud, and they had chosen that friend themselves, and they had chosen wrong, though not out of carelessness. They had chosen out of love, which is a different kind of mistake, and a gentler one, and it cost them everything. His father put his wand down that evening. That is the small detail that stays with people, and it is worth saying softly, he had been playing with the baby, making puffs of smoke, and he set the wand on the sofa the way you set anything down in your own house, because your own house is the one place where you are allowed to stop being ready. So when the gate opened and the front door came apart, he had nothing in his hands at all. He shouted for his wife to run, to take Harry and go, and he went to meet the man in the hall anyway, empty-handed, to buy her the stairs. It did not take long. He died in his own hallway, in the dark, and the house went very still. Upstairs, Lily Potter had already put her son in his cot. There was no way out of that room. The window, the drop, the night, none of it was a way out, and she must have known it in the second she heard the front door go. What she did instead was stand between the cot and the door. She was asked to move. She was asked more than once, and this is the part that matters more than any spell in the whole long story. She was offered her life, plainly, if she would simply step aside, and she would not. She begged for the baby instead. She asked for him and not for herself, over and over, until there was no more time to ask, and then there was a flash of green light in a nursery in a village on Halloween, and she fell, and the room was quiet, and the only thing left standing in it was a child holding the bars of his cot. He did not know to be frightened, not properly. He had a mother's voice in his ears, and then he had none. And when the wand turned on him, when the same curse that had emptied the hallway and emptied the nursery came for a 15-month-old boy, it found something in the way that it had never met before and did not know how to name. Because Lily had died refusing to move, and had died for him when she had been given the choice not to, she had left something behind on his skin. Old magic, the oldest there is. Not a charm anyone casts, but a thing that simply happens, the way water finds a level. The curse struck it and could not pass. It broke apart on him like a wave on a rock and went back the way it had come. What it did to the man who cast it is hard to describe, and the story has never quite settled on the words. He was torn out of his own body. Not killed. He had done things to himself long before that night. Terrible arrangements, quiet insurances, and they held. But everything that made him a man in a room was ripped away, and what was left was less than a ghost. Less than the poorest ghost drifting along a corridor, a torn scrap of a soul with no hands and no voice, blown out of the ruined house and away over the fields and out of England altogether. The roof came down, the nursery filled with dust and cold air, and the baby, sitting in the wreck of his cot with a cut on his forehead in the shape of a stroke of lightning, cried for a while, because his head hurt, and then stopped, because no one came. Someone did come, eventually, a very large man, so large that people who saw him assumed a trick of the light, came, walking up the lane with his coat pockets full and his beard wet, and went into that broken house and did the only thing left to do, which was pick the child up. He carried him out through the front garden, past the gate, and stood there holding him against his chest, and cried the way big men cry, silently and all at once. A young man arrived on a motorbike, white-faced, and wanted to take his godson himself, and was told he could not, and gave up the bike instead, handed over the keys because he had somewhere else to be and something else to do, and it would ruin him. So Hagrid, who was the large man's name, strapped a 15-month-old to his front inside his coat, and lifted a flying motorcycle off the ground in a village in the West Country, and flew south through the dark for the whole of the night. It is a strange, tender picture if you sit with it. The clouds cold, and the wind loud, and the engine grumbling. The bike wobbling because its rider had never been much good at flying anything, and the child asleep, actually asleep, warm as toast, tucked against a chest the size of a door, sleeping through the last night of the war as though it were nothing but a long car journey. He slept over the hills and over the motorways with their little chains of lights, and he was still asleep when the bike came down at the end of a road where every house had the same square of grass in front of it and the same clipped hedge, and where two people were already waiting in the dark. One of them put out the street lamps with a silver lighter. Click, 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 gathering the light into it like water into a jar until the whole road was left with nothing but moonlight and a cat's eyes. He was old and very tall, with a long silver beard and half-moon glasses, and a way of standing that made you think he had all the time there was. The other had spent the entire day sitting on a garden wall as a tabby cat, watching the family in number 4 come and go, and had not liked one single thing she had seen, and said so, and went on saying so, that they were the worst sort of people, that the boy would be famous before he could walk, and would be better raised by anyone else, anyone at all. The old man did not really argue. He agreed with most of it. He only said, gently, that the protection Harry's mother had left on him was tied to her blood, and that as long as he could call the house where her sister lived his home, no one who wanted to hurt him could touch him there. It was not kindness he was choosing. It was the one wall he could build. So they put him down on the step. A bundle of blankets on a cold stone doorstep in November, and a letter tucked in beside him explaining everything, and the three of them standing there a moment longer than they needed to. Hagrid sobbed into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. The old man said something quiet to a sleeping baby, wished him luck, and turned away. The lamps came back on, one by one, all down the street. The cat became a woman again and walked to the corner and was gone, and Harry Potter slept on, without knowing that at that exact hour, in 100 places across the country, people who had lived in fear for 11 years were raising glasses in the street to a boy whose name they were saying out loud for the very first time. He grew up 10 feet from the front door. In a cupboard under the stairs, there was a mattress in there, and a bare bulb and a lot of spiders, and the underside of the staircase came down at an angle, so that as he got taller he had to learn where to duck. When his aunt wanted him, she rapped on the door. When his cousin came thundering down to breakfast, dust came off the ceiling and settled in his hair. It was not a dungeon. That is somehow the sadder part. It was an ordinary cupboard in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and the people who put him in it went to work and mowed the lawn and complained about the neighbors and thought of themselves as perfectly decent. They told him his parents had died in a car crash. They told him the scar on his forehead came from the same crash, and they got annoyed when he asked questions. So after a while he stopped asking. His cousin Dudley was round and loud and had a bedroom full of toys he had broken, and a second bedroom for the ones he had not got round to breaking, and his favorite game for years was chasing Harry with his friends. Harry got good at running. He got good at being small and quiet, at wearing clothes 4 sizes too big because they were Dudley's first, at being left with the neighbor and her cabbage-smelling cats on birthdays that were not his. He was a skinny boy with black hair that never lay flat and green eyes behind glasses held together with tape, and nobody had ever told him he had his mother's eyes, and nobody had ever told him he was anything but trouble. And yet, odd things happened around him. They happened the way weather happens, without warning and without anyone's permission. His aunt cut his hair almost to the scalp once, so short he was afraid to go to school, and it had all grown back overnight, exactly as it had been, as if the scissors had simply been overruled. She tried to force him into a revolting old jumper of Dudley's, and the thing shrank in her hands as she pulled it down, kept shrinking, until it would not have fitted a puppet, and she decided it must have come out wrong in the wash. He was running from Dudley's gang once and found himself sitting on the school kitchen chimney with no memory of how he got up there, and was accused of climbing. Every time he was punished for it. Every time he had no idea what he had done. And this is the part everyone forgets. For 10 years he thought of himself as a boy that strange things happened to, which is quite different from a boy who can do strange things, and much lonelier. The clearest of them came at the zoo, on Dudley's birthday. In front of the reptile house glass, Harry had been talking to a great sleeping boa constrictor, talking and being answered, though he did not think that odd until much later, and Dudley shoved him out of the way to see, and something went through Harry like a cold current, and the glass simply was not there anymore. The snake poured out onto the tiles, thanked him politely as it went, and slid away towards the exit while grown adults climbed onto benches. Dudley ended up on the wrong side of the glass, which had come back, and Harry ended up in the cupboard for the longest stretch of his life so far, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle above him, wondering, not for the first time, whether he was mad. Then, the summer he was almost 11, the letters came. The first was a heavy yellowish envelope with green ink and no stamp, addressed to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive. Addressed, in other words, by someone who knew precisely where he slept. His uncle took it before he could open it and went a curious color. The next day 2 came, then 3, pushed under the door. His uncle nailed up the letterbox, and they came through the sides of the door, rolled up inside eggs, folded into the milk bottles on the step. They came down the chimney in a great soft white blizzard one Sunday morning, 30 or 40 of them at once, spinning in the air like snow, while a large man swatted at them and roared. It should have been frightening, and it was not. Harry, sitting on the floor being shouted at, was quietly, secretly, absurdly happy, because somebody in the world was trying this hard to reach him, and had been trying for days, and would not stop. His uncle stopped sleeping. He boarded up the house and then abandoned it, and drove them all day and half the next, out of the town, along coasts, doubling back down lanes, staying in a miserable gray hotel where the letters found them at breakfast anyway, until at last, half mad, he bought passage in a rented rowing boat and took his family out across freezing water to a shack on a rock in the middle of the sea. It was a hut with 2 rooms, a damp fireplace, no food to speak of, and a storm coming in. They ate a packet of crisps and a banana each. The wind screamed, and the sea threw itself at the rock, and the rain came down like nails on the roof, and Harry lay on the cold floor by the dying fire, watching the luminous hands of Dudley's watch crawl round towards midnight, and drew a birthday cake for himself in the dust with one finger, because he would be 11 in 3 minutes, and nobody in that hut was going to mention it. Somebody did mention it. At midnight exactly there was a boom on the door, and the door came off its hinges, and a man the size of a small barn stooped in out of the storm, put the door back, apologized for the weather, and asked whether anyone would mind if he got the fire going. He sat down on the sofa, which sagged, and pulled from the pockets of his enormous coat a squashed box containing a chocolate cake with green icing and Harry's name on it, made by hand, and wished him a happy birthday. Nobody had ever done that. That was the first thing. Before wizards, before the whole world opening up like a door, there was simply a stranger in a wet coat handing a boy a cake he had baked himself, and Harry sat there holding it and could not think of a single thing to say. The rest came out slowly, and then not slowly at all. Hagrid told him, in a voice that had gone thick and unsteady, that he was a wizard, that he had always been one, that the letters had been for him and had been kept from him, that there was a school waiting and that his name had been down for it since the day he was born. And when he understood, from the way Harry looked at him, that the boy genuinely did not know, that 10 years had been allowed to pass in a cupboard with a lie about a car crash in them, Hagrid became angrier than Harry had ever seen anyone become. And it was not a frightening kind of anger. He told him that his parents had not died in any car crash at all, that they had been a witch and a wizard, that they had been good at it and better than good, that they had been murdered by a man whose name Hagrid could hardly bring himself to say, and that Harry had been there, and that the reason he had a scar on his forehead was that a curse had hit him and had not worked, and that this was the reason every witch and wizard alive knew who he was. The rain came down on the roof. The fire spat, and Harry, sitting on a cold floor in the middle of the sea with cake in his lap, learned that he had been loved once, very much, by two people with faces, and names, and voices, and that they had died standing in front of him. The morning after was one long soft astonishment. They took the boat back and the train up, and walked out into a busy London street, and Hagrid stopped at a shabby little pub that the crowds walked past without seeing, because they could not see it. Inside, the moment the barman said Harry's name, the room stood up. Everyone wanted his hand. An old woman cried. A man shook his fingers so hard his glasses slid down, and shook them again, and had to be moved along, and Harry, who had spent a decade perfecting the art of not being noticed, was passed from stranger to stranger like something precious, and had no idea what to do with his face. Then, out through the back, into a small walled yard with a dustbin in it, and Hagrid tapped a certain brick 3 times with a pink umbrella, and the wall folded itself open onto a long, crooked cobbled street that had been there, humming away all his life. Diagon Alley smelled of parchment and hot metal and something sweet. There were cauldrons stacked outside a shop, and barrels of slime, and a window of owls all asleep with their eyes half open, and racks of robes, and a broomstick with a crowd of boys pressed to the glass. And at the top of the street, white and crooked and leaning, the bank, run by goblins, where a cart took them rattling down through miles of tunnels past an underground lake to a vault that opened on a small mountain of gold. His gold, left for him, saved for him, waiting the whole time he was being told he cost too much to feed. He could not take it in. He kept looking at Hagrid to check. They finished at a narrow, dusty shop with a single wand on a faded cushion in the window, where an old man with pale, wide eyes remembered every wand he had ever sold, and remembered, in particular, the 2 he had sold to Harry's parents, and described them the way you would describe old friends. Wand after wand was tried and snatched back. The pile grew. The old man got happier the worse it went, and then he brought out one of holly, 11 inches, springy, and the moment it was in Harry's hand there was warmth in his fingers and a spray of red and gold sparks across the dark shop like a small firework. The old man went very quiet. He told Harry, almost apologetically, that the core of that wand was a feather from a phoenix, and that the bird in question had only ever given 2, and that the other one, Its brother was the wand that had given him his scar. Curious, he said, that the wand should choose him. And Harry walked out into the sun of the street with the box under his arm and did not know what to make of any of it. There was a ticket in his pocket by then for the 1st of September, and a snowy owl in a cage as a birthday present, and a trunk, and a school list, and a place to go. He went back to the cupboard for a few more weeks, but it had stopped being the whole world. It was just a small dark room he was passing through. He lay in it at night with the owl asleep and her head under her wing, counting off the days on a piece of paper, and slept better than he had ever slept in his life. And on a September morning, on a crowded platform, with a trolley and a cage and no clear idea of where he was meant to go, he would be about to become someone else entirely, though he would not have said it like that. He would only have said that he had somewhere to be, and that for the first time. Someone was expecting him. The morning he left, the whole world had gone very quiet, the way a house goes quiet when something enormous has just walked out of it and closed the door softly behind. Harry Potter, 11 years old and thin as a coat hanger, stood on a station platform in London, with a trolley, an owl, and a trunk that held everything he owned, and no one to tell him where to go. Number 4. Privet Drive, with its trimmed hedges and its cupboard under the stairs, and its careful, terrible tidiness, was behind him now, and would stay behind him for a long while, and though he did not yet know how to say so, some small hinge in his chest had already swung open. The trouble was the ticket. It said platform 9 3/4, and there was a platform 9, and there was a platform 10, and between them there was nothing but a solid brick barrier with a metal number bolted to it, and the Dursleys had driven away laughing at him for it. He stood there a long moment in the noise of the concourse, the announcements echoing under the great iron roof, pigeons wheeling in the high girders, and he felt the old familiar cold of being the only person in the world who did not know the thing everyone else knew. And then a woman with red hair went past him, talking cheerfully about muggles, and a whole family of red-haired children came behind her, and Harry followed them because there was nothing else to follow, and asked, and was told, kindly and without any fuss at all, that you simply walked at the wall and did not stop and did not be frightened, and that it was easier if you ran. So he ran, and the wall did not stop him, and the noise of the station fell away like a coat sliding off a chair, and he came out into steam and lamplight, and a scarlet engine breathing gently at a curved platform, and cats winding between legs, and owls hooting to one another in the rafters, and hundreds of children shouting hello. That was the first great mercy of his life, if you like. Not a spell, not a wand, just a wall that let him through. He would remember the smell of it afterwards, coal smoke, and hot metal, and autumn, for the rest of his years. He found an empty compartment near the end of the train, and heaved his trunk up in stages, and a red-haired boy came, and asked if the other seat was taken, and that was Ron Weasley, the 6th son of a family of 7, in second-hand robes, with a smudge of soot on his nose that he could not be told about without embarrassment. They talked all the way north. Ron had a rat named Scabbers, who was old and fat and did almost nothing, and a wand that had belonged to his brother, and an entire family already at the school, and Harry had none of those things, and every one of them sounded like treasure. When the trolley came, Harry bought everything on it, more sweets than he had ever been permitted to look at, and pushed them into the middle of the seat. And Ron, who had been sitting with lumpy sandwiches he did not want, stopped being careful about him after that. That is often how it happens. Somewhere in the middle of England they were simply friends, and neither of them had noticed the moment it occurred, A girl came looking for a missing toad. She had a great deal of brown hair and a very brisk manner, and had already read all her school books, all of them, twice, and she informed them of this. She corrected Ron's spell and mended Harry's glasses with a flick and left again in a swirl of certainty. And both boys agreed privately that they hoped they would not be in her house. Hermione Granger would take rather longer to arrive than Ron had. Some friendships come like weather, and some have to be built, stone by stone, out of the wreckage of a bad first impression. It was dark when the train stopped, and cold, and the first years were called away from the others by an enormous shape with a lamp, and led down a steep, narrow path through trees where nobody could see anything at all. And then the path opened, and the trees ended, and there was the lake, black and vast and utterly still, like a held breath, and on the far side, on a high crag, the castle, with its towers and its turrets and hundreds of lit windows burning gold against the sky. Nobody said anything for a moment, for to a boat they went out across that black water, and the little fleet moved without oars, and Harry sat with his hand on the gunwale and looked up as the castle rose and rose above him, and there is a particular kind of silence that a group of 11-year-olds only ever makes once. They passed through a curtain of ivy into an underground harbor and climbed stone steps and stood at last, damp and shivering and awed, in a chamber off the entrance hall, waiting to be sorted. The great hall, when the doors opened, was the second great mercy. Thousands of candles floated in the air above 4 long tables, burning without holders, and the ceiling was not a ceiling at all, but the night sky, velvet black and scattered with stars, bewitched to look like the weather outside. Golden plates and goblets glittered along the wood. At the far end sat the teachers, and in front of them a stool, and on the stool a patched and frayed and unspeakably old pointed hat, which sang. Then, one by one, the children were called forward, and the hat was placed on their heads, and it shouted out a house. When Harry's turn came, the hall whispered his name to itself, and he sat down, and the hat slid over his eyes and blocked everything out, and then a small voice spoke to him from inside his own head, which was a thing he had not been warned about. It told him he had courage, and a good mind, and talent, and a certain thirst to prove himself. It murmured that it knew where to put him. It said that Slytherin would help him on the way to greatness, that everything he wanted was there, that it was all in his head and difficult to hide. Harry, gripping the edges of the stool, thought over and over, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin." The hat asked him why not. It told him he could be great, that it was all there in him, and that Slytherin would help him. Harry only kept thinking the same small, stubborn thought, and the hat sighed, and considered, and at last, because it was, in the end, a hat that listened, it decided otherwise, and called out Gryffindor, and the table on the left exploded. Harry walked to it with his legs shaking. It would take him years to understand what that argument had really been about, and longer still to be told that it is our choices, far more than our abilities, that show what we truly are. Then there was food. More food than the Dursleys had ever put in front of him in his whole life, appearing on the plates out of nowhere, roast meat and potatoes and gravy and, later, treacle tart. And the ghosts drifted through the tables, pearly white and slightly transparent, chatting to the students as though they had all the time in the world, which of course they did. The Gryffindor ghost was a courtly, mournful gentleman whose head had not been taken off cleanly, and who was rather sensitive about it. There was a poltergeist who threw things, and a ghost in the dungeons who was covered in silvery blood and never spoke at all. Harry looked up at the false stars and could not entirely make himself believe he was allowed to be there. The first weeks were a soft chaos. The castle was 142 staircases, and some of them were wide and sweeping, and some narrow and rickety, and some led somewhere different on Fridays, and some had a vanishing step halfway up that you had to remember to jump. There were doors that would not open unless you asked politely, and doors that were not doors at all but only very solid walls pretending. The portraits gossiped and visited one another's frames. Getting to lessons was harder than the lessons. Harry learned to turn stars into needles by candlelight in Transfiguration, and to swish and flick in charms with the tiny professor who stood on a pile of books, and to name the properties of plants in the greenhouses where the air was warm and green and wet and smelled of soil and growing things, which became, quietly, one of his favorite places in the world. He learned that astronomy meant midnight on the highest tower with a telescope and a cold nose, and that history of magic was taught by a ghost who had died in the staff room and simply got up and carried on, and whose voice was such a perfect gray drone that half the class slept through the goblin rebellions every week. And then there was Snape. The master of potions kept his dungeon dim and cold, with pickled things floating in jars along the walls, and he disliked Harry from the very first lesson in a way that had no visible cause and no visible bottom. He asked him 3 questions no first year could possibly have answered, and told him that fame was clearly not everything, and took a point from Gryffindor because Harry had not thought to tell Neville his cauldron was wrong. The dislike was not ordinary schoolmaster impatience. It was old and particular and personal, and Harry could feel that, and could not account for it, and it sat in him like a stone in a shoe. It would be years before he learned that Snape had loved his mother and hated his father, and had been looking at Harry's face and seeing both of them at once, every single day. Flying was different. Flying was the first thing Harry had ever been good at without being taught. On a clear September afternoon, the first years stood on the lawn beside their broomsticks, and Neville Longbottom, who was nervous and unlucky and kind, got off the ground too early and came down badly and broke his wrist, and in the confusion, Draco Malfoy picked up the little glass Remembrall Neville's grandmother had sent him and threw it high across the grounds. Harry was in the air before he had decided to be. He went after it in a long, steep dive with the wind roaring in his ears and the grass rushing up, and caught it a foot from the ground, and pulled out, and landed neatly, and turned round to find Professor McGonagall walking towards him very fast, and thought his life at Hogwarts was over. Instead, she took him to find the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, and Harry became the youngest seeker in a century, and was given a broom of his own, and lay awake that night with his heart going like a drum. The mail brought his Nimbus 2000 a few days later, and he flew alone at dusk over the pitch, and understood, in some wordless way, that this was a thing his father had done too. Halloween brought the troll. It came in, 12 feet of it, gray and lumpish and smelling appalling, dragging a great wooden club, and the feast broke up in a panic, and Harry and Ron remembered that Hermione was in a bathroom, crying, and did not know. She had been crying because of something Ron had said about her, carelessly and loudly, and it had been true and cruel at the same time, which is the worst kind of true. They went for her. They found the troll had gone the same way. What happened after that was mostly luck and shouting, and a wand ending up in a nostril, and a club swung by a creature too stupid to aim. And at the end of it, the troll was flat on the floor, and the 3 of them were staring at each other, filthy and shaking. And when the teachers came, Hermione, who had never told a lie in her life, who thought rules were the shape of the world, looked Professor McGonagall in the face and said it had all been her fault, that she had gone looking for the troll herself, and that the boys had saved her. That was the moment. There are things you cannot go through with people and remain strangers, and from that night they were 3, and stayed 3. November brought Harry's first Quidditch match, and cold air, and the whole school in scarves, and halfway through it his broom tried to throw him off. It bucked and rolled and jerked and slid sideways in the air, with him clinging to it by one hand, hundreds of feet up, while nobody could get near him. And in the stands, Hermione, who had worked out that a broom could only be tampered with by unbroken eye contact and had spotted Snape muttering with his eyes fixed on Harry, fought her way along a row and set fire to the hem of his robes, very small and very neatly, and in the scuffle that followed the eye contact broke, and the broom went still. Harry pulled himself back on, dived, nearly swallowed the snitch, and caught it in his mouth, and Gryffindor won, and the 3 of them went down to the gamekeeper's hut afterwards and drank tea in front of the fire, and put together, wrongly but not entirely wrongly, the beginnings of a theory about a certain 3-headed dog, and a certain locked trapdoor, and a certain thing that had been taken out of a vault at Gringotts on Harry's birthday. The day before, somebody broke in looking for it. Christmas came, and snow, and most of the school went home, and Harry did not, and it was the happiest Christmas he had ever had. The castle in December was a different place entirely. 12 towering fir trees in the great hall hung with icicles and candles, frost on the inside of the windows in the corridors, the lake frozen solid. The common room fire enormous, and the armchairs pulled close, and Ron staying too, because his parents were going to Romania, and the 2 of them playing wizard chess with pieces that argued and threw themselves off the board. And on Christmas morning, Harry, who had never had presents worth the name, found a small pile at the foot of his bed, and in it something fluid and silvery gray that slid through his hands like water and made him disappear when he put it on. His father's invisibility cloak, returned to him by a hand that left no name. He used it to wander the castle at night, which is what any boy would have done, and that is how he found the mirror. It stood in a disused classroom, tall as the ceiling, on clawed feet, with an inscription carved around the frame that could not be read until you thought to read it backwards. Harry looked into it and saw his parents. Not a portrait, not a photograph, his mother with her green eyes crinkling, his father waving. A whole crowd of people with his own knees and his own untidy hair, standing behind him where nobody stood. He went back the next night, and the next, and would have gone back every night for the rest of his life. On the 3rd night, Dumbledore was there in the dark, sitting on a desk, having watched him come. He did not scold. He explained, gently, that the mirror showed nothing more or less than the deepest and most desperate desire of the heart, and that Ron, who had seen himself holding cups and standing alone at the top of his family, had learned nothing truer from it than Harry had, that men had wasted away in front of it, not knowing whether what they saw was real or even possible, and that it did not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. The mirror was moved. Harry never found it again, and understood later that this had been a kindness, and that being told a hard thing softly by someone who has already made all your mistakes is one of the better things that can happen to a person. Spring brought the dragon, which was Hagrid's fault, and nobody was surprised. He had won an egg from a stranger in a pub and hatched it in the fire in his wooden house, and named it Norbert, and loved it entirely, and it grew, as dragons do, faster than love can keep up with. It bit people. It set fire to things. In the end it had to go, and Ron's brother in Romania sent friends, and there was a night on the top of the astronomy tower, under the cloak with a crate, and a great deal of tiptoeing, and the dragon left, and the cloak was forgotten on the stairs, and they were caught. 50 points each, and a detention, and for a while Gryffindor Tower would not speak to them. The detention was in the Forbidden Forest, at midnight, with Hagrid and his cowardly boarhound, because something had been killing unicorns and the thing had to be found. That was a strange, hushed, silvered hour, moonlight coming down in shafts, hooves somewhere off in the dark, centaurs stepping out of the trees to talk about Mars and refusing, in their way, to say anything useful. And then, in a clearing, the unicorn, dead, white and beautiful and terribly wrong, and crouched over it a hooded figure with its head down, drinking the silver blood. It raised its face and came at Harry, and his scar went off like a struck bell, the worst pain he had ever felt, and a centaur came out of nowhere at a gallop and drove the thing away, and carried Harry out of the wood on his back and told him, in the careful language of his kind, what it means to slay a unicorn, that you save yourself, and live a cursed half-life from the moment the blood touches your lips. After that they knew, or thought they knew. The stone under the trapdoor was the Philosopher's Stone, which made gold and made the drinker deathless, and something in the forest badly needed to be alive again, and Dumbledore had been called away to London, and the exams were over, and the evening was warm, and there was no one left to tell. So they went, 3 children, 1 invisibility cloak, past the vast 3-headed dog by playing it to sleep with a harp, and down through the trapdoor into the dark. They fell into something soft that was not soft at all, but Devil's Snare, which coils and tightens the more you fight it, and Hermione, remembering a book, made light and warmth, and it let them go. Then a chamber full of hundreds of tiny bright birds that were not birds, but flying keys, and 1 old broomstick, and Harry in the air again, doing the only thing he had ever been naturally good at. And the door opened. Then a chessboard the size of a room, with pieces as tall as men, and they had to play across it themselves and win. And Ron, who had never been the best at anything, not once, not in a family of brilliant brothers, took the place of a knight, and looked at the board for a long time, and saw the only move there was, and made it, and let himself be taken, so that Harry could go on. He was struck down and dragged aside and lay very still, and Harry made himself walk past him and not look back, which was the hardest thing he had done yet. Hermione stopped behind at the logic puzzle, because there was only enough of the right potion for one, and she worked it out from the riddle on the parchment, while Harry stood in the black flames and waited. And she told him, before he went through, that he was a great wizard, and that there were things that mattered more than books and cleverness. The last room held Quirrell, not Snape at all, poor stammering nervous Quirrell in his turban, who had been the one to let the troll in, who had been trying to kill him all year, and against whom Snape, of all people, had been quietly guarding him the whole time. Quirrell had the mirror. He could not get the stone out of it, and Harry, standing in front of it, wanting only to find the stone and never to use it, felt something heavy drop into his pocket. And then the turban came off, and on the back of Quirrell's head there was a face, chalk white, with red eyes and slits for nostrils, and it spoke, and it lied about Harry's parents, and it offered him everything if he would only hand the stone across. Harry ran. Quirrell caught him, and his hands blistered and burned where they touched Harry's skin, and burned again, and Harry held on to him with everything he had while the pain in his scar rose past bearing, and the world went out. He woke in the hospital wing 3 days later with sunlight on the bed and the whole table full of sweets and cards beside him, and Dumbledore sitting there, patient, half-moon spectacles catching the light. The stone had been destroyed. Its maker, 665 years old, had agreed to it, and would set his affairs in order, and would die. And Dumbledore said that to the well-organized mind death is only the next great adventure. Quirrell was dead, and the thing that had been living in the back of his head had left him and fled, not killed, only delayed, because he had never truly been alive and so could not truly be ended. And when Harry asked why Quirrell could not bear to touch him, Dumbledore was quiet for a while, and then told him, gently, that his mother had died to save him, and that this kind of love leaves its own mark, not a scar, not a sign, but something in the skin itself, that to have been loved that deeply, even by someone who was gone, gives a protection forever, and that Quirrell, full of hatred and greed and sharing his soul with Voldemort, could not touch a person marked by something so good. There was a feast at the end of it, and the hall hung in Slytherin green until Dumbledore, at the last possible moment and enjoying himself, awarded a handful of last points. For cold logic, for a game of chess, for nerve and daring, and 10 to Neville Longbottom for standing up to his friends, and the banners turned scarlet and gold overhead while the noise went on and on. And then the train south, and the platform, and Harry going back to Privet Drive for a summer that would be dull and small and survivable now, because it was only a summer, and there was somewhere else that was his. He slept most of the way home, his cheek against the glass, England going past in green. He had a school. He had 2 friends who had walked into the dark with him without being asked. He had a house and a bed with hangings and a fire that was always lit, and a broom, and a name that meant something, and a mother who had loved him enough to still be doing it 11 years after she died. That was the first year. There would be another one, and it would be stranger, and it would begin, as these things so often did for him, with someone arriving in the middle of the night to tell him he must not go back at all. The end of a school year is a strange kind of quiet, and the quiet that followed Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts was stranger than most, because it carried him backwards. The train had gone south through green country, and the barrier at King's Cross had let him out into a world with no owls in it, and by the middle of July, the castle felt less like a place he had lived in, and more like something he had dreamed on a long afternoon. He was back in the smallest bedroom of number 4, Privet Drive, in a house where the word magic was not permitted, and his school trunk was locked in the cupboard under the stairs, and Hedwig sulked in her cage with her feathers drawn in tight. There were no letters. That was the part that hollowed him out. Not the chores, not the silences at the dinner table, but the long, ordinary emptiness where his friends should have been, week after week, while the roses baked in the front garden, and the lawn-mowers droned, and the summer went on being warm and small, and nothing at all. He had a birthday that nobody mentioned. He turned 12 in a house that pretended he was a nuisance who had been left on a doorstep, and that evening, with the Dursleys downstairs rehearsing a dinner party for a man who made drills, Harry went up to his room and found somebody sitting on his bed. It was a very small creature with enormous ears like a bat's and eyes the size of tennis balls, wearing an old pillowcase, and it was so overwhelmed to be in Harry's presence that it kept bursting into tears and trying to punish itself against the furniture. Its name was Dobby, and it was a house elf, bound to serve a wizarding family, and it had come a very long way, at great risk, to tell Harry not to go back to Hogwarts. There was a plot, Dobby said, a terrible plot, and Harry would be in mortal danger if he returned. Harry said, quite reasonably, that Hogwarts was the only home he had, and so Dobby, who had good intentions and no sense at all of how they might land, did the only thing he could think of. He took the letters he had been intercepting all summer, the letters from Ron and Hermione that had never arrived, and he held them out and would not give them back, and then he went downstairs and dropped an enormous violet pudding on the floor of the Dursleys' kitchen in front of the drillman's wife. The Ministry of Magic, which could tell that magic had been done in the house, but not who had done it, sent Harry a stern letter about underage sorcery, and Uncle Vernon, who had lost his order and his dignity in the same evening, put bars on Harry's window and a cat flap on his door, and told him he would never go back. So the summer went very dark for 3 days. And then, in the middle of the night, Harry woke to a low humming sound outside his window and saw, hovering in the warm dark above the hydrangeas, a small turquoise car with the Weasley twins leaning out of it and Ron at the passenger window grinning. They tied a rope to the bars and pulled them clean out of the wall, and they carried his trunk and his owl out through the hole, and by the time Uncle Vernon had lunged out of the window and got a grip on Harry's ankle, the car was already rising, and Harry was pulled up into the night, and Privet Drive shrank away below him into a pattern of orange lights, and then there was nothing but sky. The Burrow, when they came down to it in the gray light before dawn, was not a grand house. It looked as though it had begun life as a stone pigsty and had then had rooms added on top of it, 4 or 5 stories of them, leaning slightly, held up by what was almost certainly magic. There were chickens in the yard and Wellington boots by the door, and a clock on the wall, whose hands were not ours, but people. Each one pointing to words like home or work or traveling or, occasionally, mortal peril, which nobody seemed to find alarming. Mrs. Weasley shouted at her sons for stealing the car and then fed Harry until he could not move. And Harry, sitting there in a kitchen crowded with unwashed pots and a self-stirring sauce and a copy of the newspaper with photographs that moved, thought that it was the best house he had ever been in. Not because it was clean, because it wasn't. Because everything in it belonged to somebody who loved somebody else. He denomed the garden with Ron, which meant swinging small leathery potato-like creatures around by the ankles until they were dizzy enough to be thrown over the hedge. He slept in the attic room under the orange glare of Ron's Chudley Cannons posters, with the goal banging on the pipes overhead, and it rained in the night, and he lay listening to the rain on the crooked roof and the water in the gutters, and thought that this exact sound was what he had been missing all summer without knowing its name. There was a girl there too, the youngest Weasley, Ginny, who was going to Hogwarts for the first time that year, and who could not seem to be in a room with Harry without knocking something over, or leaving it altogether. In Diagon Alley, they met a man called Gilderoy Lockhart, all teeth and turquoise robes, who was signing his own books in flourish and blots, and who seized Harry when he saw him and posed for the photographers, and announced that he would be teaching at Hogwarts that year, and the entire prescribed book list for Defense Against the Dark Arts turned out to be his own memoirs. And in the same shop Mr. Weasley and Lucius Malfoy came to blows among the spellbooks, pale-haired Lucius with his silver-topped cane, sneering at the shabbiness of the Weasleys, and he dropped a battered old diary into Ginny's cauldron among her second-hand schoolbooks, and nobody saw him do it, and nobody thought about it again for a long time. The 1st of September went wrong in a small way that turned into a large one. Harry and Ron, running late, went at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and the barrier did not let them through. It had gone solid. The train left without them, and rather than wait, Ron had the idea of taking the car, and so the flying Ford Anglia rose over London in broad daylight with two 12-year-olds inside it, and followed the railway line north all day, over fields and viaducts and the long spine of the country, until the invisibility booster failed and the engine began to whine, and they came down at last, out of control, into the grounds of Hogwarts, straight into the branches of a very old, very bad-tempered tree. The whomping willow did not care that they were children. It battered the car until the roof buckled and the wands broke, and Ron's wand snapped nearly in half, and then it spat them out onto the grass and threw their trunks after them, and the car itself, wounded and offended, drove away into the forbidden forest and was not seen again for a long while. Professor Snape found them. Professor McGonagall found them shortly after. They were not expelled, though Snape argued for it, and they were given detention instead, Harry with Lockhart, addressing fan mail until 2 in the morning, and Ron polishing the school's trophies without magic, while his broken wand hiccuped sparks. The year settled into itself. Second years took herbology in Greenhouse 3, where Professor Sprout had them repot mandrakes, and Harry learned that a mandrake is a small, muddy, extremely ugly baby with leaves for hair, and that its cry, when it is full grown, can kill, and that even an infant's cry can knock a person out for hours. They wore earmuffs. They pressed the squirming little roots down into fresh compost and told them, in the manner of the greenhouse, to be quiet, and the rain moved across the glass overhead, and the whole hour smelled of wet earth and dragon dung fertilizer and green leaves. Lockhart taught by letting a cage of Cornish pixies loose in a classroom and then leaving the children to deal with them. Ron's wand, mended with spellotape, produced results nobody could predict, and on Halloween, coming down from a Death Day party in the dungeons where the food had been left to rot for 400 years, and the ghosts had drifted through one another in the candlelight, Harry heard something. It was a voice, and it was in the walls. Nobody else heard it. It was cold and hungry, and it spoke of ripping and tearing and killing, and it moved upwards, and Harry followed it because he could not think what else to do, and at the end of a corridor on the 2nd floor there was water on the flagstones, reflecting the torches, and Mrs. Norris the caretaker's cat hung stiff and staring from a bracket on the wall, and above her, in letters a foot high, written in something that shone dark red, was a message. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened. Enemies of the heir, it said, beware. And then the whole school came around the corner at once, because the feast had ended, and there stood Harry Potter in front of the writing with everybody looking at him. The legend came out slowly, the way old stories do. Professor Binns, who had died and gone on teaching history of magic without noticing, was pestered into telling it. 1,000 years ago, 4 great witches and wizards had founded the school together, and 3 of them had agreed with each other about most things, and the 4th, Salazar Slytherin, had wanted to admit only children of magical families. He had quarreled with Godric Gryffindor, and he had left. But the story said that before he went he had built a hidden chamber somewhere in the castle, and sealed it, so that only his own true heir could ever open it, and release the horror inside to purge the school of those he thought unworthy. It was a legend. Binns himself said so, with a certain weariness. The castle had been searched many times, and no chamber had ever been found. And yet the cat was petrified, and the writing was on the wall, and Slytherin's mark was in it. Then a boy was found. Colin Creevey, a first year who followed Harry with a camera, was carried into the hospital wing rigid, his camera melted, and after him others, until the corridors began to empty early and people walked in groups. And in December Lockhart founded a dueling club to raise morale, and it was there, on a stage in the Great Hall with Snape looking on with something like pleasure, that Draco Malfoy conjured a snake, and it turned towards a boy in the crowd, and Harry, without deciding to, spoke to it. He told it to leave the boy alone. In his own head he was speaking English. What came out of him was a soft hissing, and the hall went silent, and he saw the faces, and he understood, far too late, what he had done. Parselmouth, the gift of Salazar Slytherin himself, passed down through his line, and there it was in a 12-year-old boy with a scar. After that the school turned. Not all at once, and not everyone, but enough. Whispers stopped when he came into rooms. People stepped aside in corridors, and he began to wonder himself, in the small dark hours, whether the hat had been right the first time when it had murmured that he would do well in Slytherin. So the three of them decided to find out about Malfoy the only way they could think of, and Hermione, who was 12, brewed Polyjuice potion in the out-of-order bathroom on the second floor, which was haunted by a girl called Myrtle, who had died there 50 years before and had never got over it. It took a month. It smelled like overcooked cabbage, and it looked like mud, and at Christmas Harry and Ron drank it, and became Crabbe and Goyle for an hour, and learned in the Slytherin common room among the green lamps that Malfoy knew nothing at all except that his father had told him the chamber had been opened once before, 50 years ago, and a girl had died. Hermione did not come with them. She had taken a hair from Millicent Bulstrode's robes, and it had not been Millicent's, and she spent weeks in the hospital wing behind curtains, covered in black fur, with a tail and yellow eyes, waiting for it to wear off. They found the diary in the flooded bathroom, a small shabby black book with the year 1950 and a name on the back cover, T. M. Riddle. Its pages were blank. When Harry wrote in it, the ink sank into the paper and words came back in a polite, curling hand, and then the book opened and pulled him down into a memory like a photograph he could walk about in, 50 years back, into a castle that was the same and not the same, and he watched a tall, handsome, dark-haired boy of 16, a prefect with a medal for special services to the school, walk down to the dungeons at night and catch the culprit who had been opening the chamber. And the culprit was an enormous 50-year younger Rubeus Hagrid, hiding a monstrous spider in a box, and Riddle told him it was over, and Harry was thrown back out into his own bed, and lay there in the dark, not knowing what to think. Because Hagrid had been expelled, and his wand snapped, and he had been allowed to stay on as gamekeeper, and Hagrid had never once mentioned any of it. Hagrid, when they went to ask him, could not tell them, because Cornelius Fudge came to take him to Azkaban that night, not because anybody believed he was guilty, but because the ministry needed to be seen to act, and Lucius Malfoy came too, with an order suspending Dumbledore from the school. But Hagrid, on the way out, said loudly to nobody in particular that anyone who wanted to find things out would only have to follow the spiders, and so they did. In the spring, in the dark, into the Forbidden Forest, with Fang the boarhound shivering between them, following a thin line of spiders hurrying away from the castle, until the trees closed over, and the ground fell, and they came into a hollow full of a dry clicking sound, and out of a domed web came Aragog, blind and old, and the size of a small elephant, who had been Hagrid's pet and who had never harmed anyone, and who told them that he had not killed the girl 50 years ago, that the thing that lived in the castle was the one creature his kind feared above all others, the ancient beast whose name even spiders will not say. And then, being a spider and very old and no longer sentimental, he explained that his children did not share his oath of friendship with Hagrid, and Harry and Ron ran and were carried out of the hollow at the last possible moment by a battered turquoise car that had gone wild in the forest and had not forgotten them. It was Hermione, lying petrified in the hospital wing, who solved it. She had gone to the library, and she had found it, and she had torn the page out, and she was carrying it, crumpled in her hand, when whatever it was came around the corner. Nobody looked at her hand for weeks. When Harry finally uncurled her cold fingers, he found the page, and on it a description of the basilisk, the king of serpents, that lives for centuries and kills with a look, that spiders flee before, that is undone by the crowing of a rooster. And in the margin, in Hermione's handwriting, was one word: pipes. It had been moving through the plumbing all along, and everyone who had been petrified had seen it indirectly, in a mirror, through a ghost, in water, through the lens of a camera. And the girl who had died 50 years ago had died in a bathroom. That night the writing appeared again, and it said that a skeleton would lie in the chamber forever, and Ginny Weasley was gone. Harry and Ron went to Lockhart, because he had announced at dinner that he knew where the entrance was, and they found him packing. He had never done any of the things in his books. He had found people who had, and taken their memories, and taken the credit, and he was very good at memory charms, and at nothing else. They marched him at wand point to Myrtle's bathroom, and Myrtle told them, mournfully and with some satisfaction, that she had died right there, that the last thing she had seen was a pair of great yellow eyes by that sink. There was a small snake scratched into the side of one of the taps. Harry looked at it and let himself believe it was real, and hissed, and the sink sank away into a pipe wide enough for a person, and they went down. It was a long slide through the dark under the lake, into wet tunnels floored with small bones, past a shed skin 20 feet long, past a rockfall that Lockhart caused when he snatched Ron's broken wand and tried to wipe their memories and had the spell blow back into his own face, so that he sat in the rubble beaming, having forgotten everything including himself. Harry went on alone. There was a door with 7 serpents on it in emerald, and it opened, and the Chamber of Secrets was a long hall of stone pillars carved into coiling snakes, lit greenly, dripping, echoing, with a face at the far end as tall as the ceiling, the ancient face of Salazar Slytherin. And Ginny lay on the wet floor, white and still and not quite dead, and standing beside her, watching, was a boy of 16 with dark hair, transparent at the edges, who said his name was Tom Riddle, and that he was a memory preserved in a diary for 50 years. He had poured himself into that book as a boy, and Ginny had found it in her cauldron and had written in it all year, every lonely secret. And it had written back, and it had been kind to her, and it had taken her strength and given her its will, and it was her small hands that had set the serpent on the school and painted the walls and strangled the roosters. And she had known, at the end, and had tried to throw the book away, and Harry had found it. Riddle lifted Harry's wand from the floor and wrote his own name in the air in fire, and then he waved it, and the letters rearranged themselves, and Harry understood at last what the name Lord Voldemort had been made out of. an anagram, a schoolboy's invention, a thing built to bury an ordinary Muggle father's name, and Harry, who had nothing else, said the only true thing he could think of, which was that Dumbledore was the greatest wizard in the world. Riddle told him Dumbledore had been driven out by a memory. And then there was music. You have never heard anything like it, and neither had Harry. Phoenix song coming from somewhere above, so full of a sort of golden courage that it went into his chest and held his heart up. Fawkes came down through the dark and dropped into Harry's arms the Sorting Hat, and that was all. That was the help. Riddle laughed and turned to the giant stone face and hissed at it, and the mouth opened, and the basilisk came out. Harry ran with his eyes shut. The phoenix went for the serpent's face and put out its eyes, and the thing thrashed blind and murderous through the pillars, while Riddle screamed at it to smell him out. And Harry, with nothing left, jammed the hat onto his head and asked for help. And something heavy fell into it, and he pulled out a silver sword with rubies in its hilt and the name of Godric Gryffindor along the blade. He drove it up through the roof of the snake's mouth as it struck at him, and it died. And a fang the length of his hand had gone through his arm, and the venom was in him, and he lay against the wet wall in the green light, feeling it work. Riddle stood over him and told him he was dying. Harry took the fang out of his arm and drove it into the diary, and ink poured out of it like blood, and Riddle came apart, screaming without sound, and was gone. And Ginny woke. Fawkes came and laid his beautiful head on Harry's arm and wept, and Phoenix tears heal, and the wound closed as though it had never been. They went up through the tunnels together, the bird carrying all four of them into the light, and Ginny cried and was forgiven, and Lockhart, who had forgotten his own name, went to St. Mungo's and was quite happy there. The mandrakes were ready, and the potion was made, and Hermione came running into the great hall that night out of the hospital wing. Dumbledore came back, and in his office, later, Harry told him the thing he had been carrying all year, that the hat had wanted to put him in Slytherin, that he could speak the snake language, that he was perhaps more like Tom Riddle than anyone knew. And Dumbledore, quite gently, said that Voldemort had transferred some of his own powers to Harry the night he gave him that scar, certainly, and that Harry did indeed share qualities Salazar Slytherin prized. But the hat had put him in Gryffindor, because he had asked it not to put him anywhere else. It is our choices, Dumbledore said, far more than our abilities, that show what we truly are. And he set the sword of Gryffindor on the desk between them, where the name was, and asked Harry to look at it, because only a true Gryffindor could ever have pulled that out of that hat. There was one more thing. Lucius Malfoy came storming into the office, with Dobby cringing at his heels, and Harry, working it out at last, took the ruined diary and stuffed it into one of his own socks and gave it back to Malfoy, who threw the sock aside in disgust, and Dobby caught it. A house elf is freed by being given clothes. It is a very old rule, and nobody had ever thought about it hard enough. Dobby stood there in the corridor, holding one filthy sock as though it were the crown of the world, and Lucius Malfoy went away with nothing. The last feast went on all night, and exams were cancelled, and Hagrid came back from Azkaban and was hugged so hard he nearly fell over, and Gryffindor won the House Cup because Slytherin's points were docked into oblivion. Then the train, going south again through the long green afternoon, and the Weasleys and Hermione writing their telephone numbers on scraps of parchment for him, and Uncle Vernon waiting beyond the barrier with his moustache and his car. It ought to have been unbearable. It wasn't quite. Harry had a summer to get through. and he knew now that it would end, and that the castle would still be there when it did, with the lake and the greenhouses and the rain on the windows. He did not know yet that his 3rd year would begin with him blowing up an aunt, or that a man would escape from Azkaban for the first time in history and come looking for him, or what that man would turn out to be. All that was ahead of him, in the dark, patient and waiting, the way the future always is. For now, the train went south, and the sun went down over the fields, and it was enough, for now, to sleep. The summer after his 2nd year came slowly to Privet Drive, and Harry Potter spent it much as he had spent the summers before it, keeping quiet in a small square room, doing homework in the middle of the night by the light of a torch under the covers, because magic was forbidden and questions were worse. He was 13 now, taller than he had been, thinner than anyone would have liked, and he had learned the trick of making himself very nearly invisible in a house that would have preferred him not to exist at all. Hedwig slept in her cage with her head under her wing. The lawns outside were watered every evening at the same hour. There was, in all that dull suburban stillness, a kind of waiting, the way the air waits before weather, and Harry felt it without being able to name it, and counted the days until September. What broke the waiting was the arrival of Uncle Vernon's sister, Aunt Marge, who came with her suitcases and her bulldog Ripper and her opinions, and who stayed for days, and who spoke about Harry in his hearing as though he were a defect in the furniture. He bore it. He had bargained with his uncle for a signature on a Hogsmeade permission form, and the price of that signature was silence, so he swallowed each remark as it came, and looked at his plate and thought about nothing. But on the last evening, warm with brandy, Aunt Marge began to speak about his mother and his father, about bad blood and drunkenness and a wastrel's death in a car crash, and something in Harry that had been held down very carefully for 12 years came quietly loose. He did not decide anything. He simply felt the pressure rise and the glass in her hand burst. And then Aunt Marge herself began to swell, buttons springing, fingers puffing like sausages, rising slowly and majestically toward the ceiling and out through the door into the night sky, drifting over the garden like a monstrous balloon while Ripper barked below. He left within the hour. He dragged his trunk out into the dark with Hedwig's cage rattling on top of it, and walked without any plan at all, and sat down at last on the low wall of Magnolia Crescent with his wand in his hand, expelled, he assumed, and homeless, and strangely calm about it. It was there, in the gap between 2 garages, that he saw the eyes. A great black dog stood watching him out of the shadows, enormous, shaggy, absolutely silent, and Harry stumbled backward and flung out his wand hand, and with a bang like an explosion, a violently purple triple-decker bus came tearing out of nowhere and stopped in front of him. The dog was gone. The conductor, a young man with a great many pimples and a great deal to say, explained that this was the night bus, emergency transport for the stranded witch or wizard, and Harry, who had nowhere else to go, gave a false name and climbed aboard. The ride was ridiculous, and it was, in its way, a mercy. There were beds instead of seats, and the beds slid about the aisle whenever the bus jumped 100 miles at a time, and lampposts and letterboxes leapt out of the road to let it pass. Somewhere in all that lurching Harry learned from a discarded newspaper that a man named Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, the wizard prison, and that he was a murderer, and that even the Muggle world had been told to look out for him. The name meant nothing to Harry then. He was set down in London outside a shabby pub called the Leaky Cauldron, expecting punishment, and instead found the Minister for Magic himself waiting in a private parlor, oddly warm, oddly eager, telling him that the matter of his aunt was closed, that she had been deflated and her memory adjusted, and that Harry might spend the rest of the summer in Diagon Alley if he promised to stay within it. He was not expelled. He was not even scolded. It made no sense, and he was too tired to wonder why. So he had 2 weeks that were as close to happiness as any he had known, a room above the pub with a soft bed, breakfast downstairs, and the cobbled street outside full of sunlight and owls. He did his homework at a table outside the ice cream parlor, where the man who owned it helped him with his medieval witch burnings and gave him sundaes every half hour. He stood a long while at the window of the Quidditch shop, looking at a broomstick called the Firebolt, which had no price on its card, because if you had to ask you could not afford it. He bought his books, including a snarling volume that had to be stroked down the spine before it would open. Ron and Hermione arrived at the end, sunburned from Egypt and from France, and Harry, hiding on the stairs the night before term, overheard Ron's parents arguing in low voices about whether he should be told that Sirius Black had escaped in order to find him. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross in rain. The only compartment with room in it held a sleeping man in shabby robes whose case said R. Jay, Lupin, and the 3 of them talked around him in whispers, and Ron's rat scabbers lay in a pocket looking thin and unwell, and Hermione's new cat Crookshanks, orange and squash-faced, watched that pocket with a patience that nobody liked. Somewhere in the wet green afternoon the train slowed and stopped in the middle of nowhere. The lamps went out. The windows furred with ice from the inside. Cold came into the carriage, not the cold of weather, but a deeper thing. A cold that reached in and took hold of whatever was warm and put it out, and a tall, cloaked shape glided into the doorway and drew a long, rattling breath, and Harry heard, from very far away and very close, a woman screaming. Then nothing. He came round on the floor with Lupin kneeling over him, and the creature was gone, and there was chocolate, thick and good, pressed into his hand, and the warmth of it went out through him to his fingertips like a spell of its own. The thing had been a dementor. Lupin told him, one of the guards of Azkaban sent to search the train for Sirius Black. They fed on happiness. They came nearest to those who had the worst to remember. Harry, who had fainted while everyone else had merely felt sad, said nothing about the screaming, and ate his chocolate, and watched the rain, and understood without being told that the scream had been his mother. Hogwarts received them, as it always did, with candlelight and hot food, and the vast starry ceiling of the great hall. There were dementors now, ringed around the grounds, standing at every entrance like sentries made of cold, and Dumbledore said, in his mild way, that they were not to be reasoned with, and not to be fooled by cloaks or by tricks. He also introduced Professor Lupin, who was to teach defense against the dark arts, and announced that Hagrid, beaming so hard he had to hide his face in his tablecloth, would be teaching care of magical creatures. And so the year began, divination in a hot perfumed tower where Professor Trelawney peered into Harry's teacup and saw the Grim, the great black spectral dog, whose appearance meant death. Hermione taking so many subjects that her timetable made no arithmetical sense and refusing to explain it. The castle settling into autumn. Hagrid's first lesson was Buckbeak. He brought a dozen hippogriffs out into a paddock, great creatures with the front halves of eagles and the hind halves of horses, cruel curved beaks and fierce orange eyes, and feathers that shaded into hide along their flanks. They were proud, he said, and easily offended, and one must bow and wait to be bowed to. Harry bowed. Buckbeak, after a long insulting pause, went down on his scaly knees, and Harry was told to pat him, and the feathers under his hand were smooth and warm and slightly overlapping, like slate, like scales, like nothing else. And then he was on the creature's back and lifting, and the lake went past beneath him silver and creased, and he came down laughing. Draco Malfoy, who had watched all this, walked up to Buckbeak and called him an ugly great brute, and the hippogriff opened him from shoulder to elbow in one clean, unhurried strike, and lay down in the grass. And everything after that was ruin. The sling, the letters home, Lucius Malfoy's fury, and Hagrid weeping into his teapot with his lesson plans in the fire. Lupin's first lesson was a boggart in a wardrobe, a shapeshifter that became whatever the person before it feared most, and the way to beat it was to force it into something absurd and then to laugh. He put Neville up first, and the boggart came out as Snape, and went back in wearing Neville's grandmother's hat and handbag and fox fur stole, and the class laughed until it hurt. There were rats on skateboards and giant spiders with roller skates and a mummy tripping over its bandages, and Harry stepped forward and thought quite clearly of a floating hooded shape, and Lupin moved in front of him and finished the thing himself. Afterwards he explained, gently, that he had feared Harry's boggart would take the form of Voldemort in the middle of a classroom of 13-year-olds, and Harry let it go, though he knew, and thought Lupin knew, that it would have been a dementor. The winter came in. On Halloween the school went down to Hogsmeade, and Harry did not, because the Dursleys had never signed his form, and he wandered the empty castle instead, and drank tea with Lupin in his office, while a Grindelow sulked in its tank. And that night the fat lady's portrait was found slashed to ribbons, and the fat lady herself hiding in another painting, and the students slept in the great hall in purple sleeping bags under the enchanted ceiling while the teachers searched. And Sirius Black had been inside the castle. He had a knife. He had come to the 7th floor. Nobody could say how. After that the corridors were watched, and the passwords changed weekly, and Harry was followed everywhere by anxious eyes, and told nothing. The telling, when it came by accident. On a bright, snowy Hogsmeade weekend, he went down under his father's invisibility cloak, through a passage behind a one-eyed witch, using a piece of parchment Fred and George had pressed on him, with the air of men handing over the crown jewels, the Marauders map, which showed every room and every passage of Hogwarts, and every person moving in them as a labeled dot, and which had been made. Its insolent inscription said, by Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot and Prongs. He saw the snow on the shrieking shack, and the sweets in honeydukes, and the frost on the windows of the 3 broomsticks, and then he sat invisible under a table while the Minister for Magic and his own head of house and the Hogwarts groundskeeper talked in low voices over their drinks about Sirius Black. Black had been James Potter's best friend. Black had been best man at the wedding. Black had been made secret keeper when the Potters went into hiding, the single living person who could give them away, and he had given them away, and after Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow, another friend, a small, frightened man named Peter Pettigrew, had cornered Black in a street full of muggles, and Black had laughed and blown the street apart, killing 13 people, and all they had found of Pettigrew was a finger. Harry sat in the cold snow afterwards and could not feel it. Something in him had been rearranged. He did not tell anyone what he meant to do about it, and perhaps he did not know. But from that day the dementors were less terrible to him than his own quiet certainty, and he asked Lupin, at last, to teach him how to fight them. They met in an empty classroom in the evenings. There was a boggart in a packing case that became a dementor for him alone, and a spell called the Patronus Charm, which required him to hold in his mind one memory happy enough and strong enough to feed a shape of pure silver light. He tried his first broom ride. He tried the moment he learned he was a wizard. Each time the cold came down and the screaming began, and each time he heard a little more of it. A man telling a woman to take the boy and run. A woman begging, saying not Harry, saying take me instead, and the high cold laughter of the thing that killed her. He came round on the floor again and again, and Lupin gave him chocolate and told him gently that most fully qualified wizards never managed a corporeal Patronus at all, and Harry kept getting up, because hearing his mother's voice was unbearable, and it was also the only place she still existed. Meanwhile, Buckbeak was condemned. The Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures held its hearing, and Lucius Malfoy leaned on it, and the sentence was execution. Hagrid stopped eating. Hermione, who was doing everything at once and looked gray with it, built the defense herself out of library books. And Ron's rat vanished, leaving blood and ginger hairs on the sheets, and Ron did not speak to Hermione for weeks. And the friendship that had held them all together came apart quietly under the weight of a cat and a rat and a broomstick confiscated for testing. Spring came anyway. Exams came, and on the evening, the executioner was to come down to Hagrid's hut. The three of them, reconciled by grief, went down under the cloak to sit with him and found Scabbers alive in a milk jug. What happened afterwards happened fast and lasted the rest of Harry's life. The great black dog came out of the dusk and seized Ron by the arm and dragged him, screaming, into a hole at the roots of the Whomping Willow, and Harry and Hermione followed down a long earthen tunnel into the Shrieking Shack, which had never been haunted at all. The dog was Sirius Black. He was gaunt and filthy, and his eyes were sunken and burning, and he was an unregistered animagus, and he had not come for Harry. Lupin came down the tunnel behind them, because he had seen the map, and the map had shown him a dead man walking the grounds. And there, in that dusty, ruined room, with Harry's wand pointed at the man he had promised himself he would kill, the truth was laid out patiently, piece by piece, until it stood up on its own. They had been 4 boys once. Lupin was a werewolf, bitten as a child, brought to Hogwarts by a kind headmaster, and hidden each month in that very house at the end of that very tunnel. And his 3 friends had become animagi to keep him company through the transformations, and they had made the map and given themselves names: Moony, Wormtail, Patfoot, Prongs. Wormtail was Peter Pettigrew, who could become a rat, and Peter Pettigrew was not dead. He had been secret keeper, swapped in at the last moment at Sirius's own insistence, because who would suspect the weakest of them, and he had gone to Voldemort. And then when Sirius came for him in that Muggle Street, he had shouted his accusation aloud, cut off his own finger, blown the street apart himself, and slipped down into the sewers as a rat. And stayed one for 12 years, a fat pet in a warm pocket, while Sirius Black went to Azkaban without a trial for a murder he had not committed, and a betrayal that had been his only in the sense that he had trusted the wrong friend. He had survived, he said, because innocence is not a happy thought, and so the dementors could not eat it. Scabbers, forced back, became a small, balding, trembling man who wept and pleaded and reached for every one of them in turn. They did not kill him. Harry stopped it, and did not entirely know why, except that he did not think his father would have wanted 2 more murders done in his name, and because the Ministry would need Pettigrew alive to give Sirius back his life. So they went up the tunnel in a chain, Pettigrew shackled between Ron and Lupin, out into the summer night, and the grounds were black and soft, and there was one clear moment in which Sirius asked Harry, almost shyly, whether he might like to come and live with him when it was over, since he was his godfather, and Harry said yes, and for perhaps 2 minutes he possessed a home. Then the clouds slid away, and the full moon came out over the lake. Lupin had not taken his potion. He changed there in the grass, and in the chaos Pettigrew found a dropped wand and became a rat and was gone into the dark, and the dementors came, dozens of them, gliding across the lawn toward the 2 shapes lying by the water, and Harry stood over his godfather with a wand that would not answer, and heard his mother screaming, and felt himself going out like a candle. And then something silver came across the lake from the far bank, bright as a moon on the water, and drove them back, and Harry, on the edge of nothing, thought he saw the figure who had cast it, and thought, absurdly, that it looked like his father. He woke in the hospital wing to find that none of it had helped. The minister had Sirius locked in a tower, and a dementor coming to perform the kiss at midnight, and there was no witness and no proof and no rat. And Dumbledore, saying nothing that could be repeated, remarked that they had need of more time, and left, and Hermione pulled from beneath her robes a tiny golden hourglass on a chain that had let her sit 2 lessons at once all year. 3 turns, 3 hours. They went back through their own evening like ghosts of themselves, and freed Buckbeak from the pumpkin patch minutes before the axe fell, and hid in the forest, and watched everything happen again from the outside. And by the lake, waiting for a rescuer who never came, Harry understood at last what he had seen, and stepped out from behind the bushes and raised his wand, and thought of his godfather and of a house that might yet exist, and the Patronus that burst out of him was a stag, blazing, silver, unhurried, cantering across the water to scatter 100 dementors like leaves. Prongs, his father's shape. He had not seen his father at all. He had seen himself, and he had known he could do it because he had already done it, which is a strange and lovely kind of faith. They flew Buckbeak to the tower window, and Sirius went out over the battlements into the night, and no one who mattered would ever believe any of it. Lupin resigned in the morning because Snape had let the truth about him slip, and no parent would tolerate a werewolf teaching children. And he packed his shabby case and shook Harry's hand and told him his father would have been glad. The firebolt came back, cleared, and it had been Sirius's gift all along. Pettigrew was loose in the world, and Harry would learn eventually what that meant. But for the moment there was a letter from a warm place far away, and a godfather alive, and an examiner's report, and the long golden emptiness of the last week of term. He went back to Privet Drive that summer, with something he had never carried there before, the knowledge that there was someone in the world who wanted him. And beyond that summer, quietly, without any fuss at all, waited a stadium in a distant field, and a tournament nobody had held for centuries, and his 4th year. He came back to Privet Drive that summer with the taste of a strange freedom still in his mouth. A godfather somewhere out in the wide, warm dark, and for the first time, the certainty that there was a person in the world who had wanted him before he could be useful to anyone. It was a small thing to carry through July, but he carried it, and far away, in a village called Little Hangleton, in a great empty house on the hill above it, An old caretaker named Frank Bryce woke one night to a light burning in a window that should have held no light at all, and went up to see, and did not come down again, and the boy in Surrey woke at the same hour with his scar burning and did not understand why, and wrote a letter about it, and folded it away, and told himself it was only a dream. Sleep is kind that way. It lets us set things down. Then the Weasleys came for him, in their loud and generous fashion, and there was a portkey on a hill at dawn, a moldy old boot lying in the wet grass, holding, in its ruined shape, the whole of the wizarding world's habit of hiding wonders inside rubbish, and a lurch behind the navel, and then a field. The field is worth lingering over, because it was the last simple happiness of that year. Imagine a great green bowl of England filling slowly with people who had come from everywhere, tents in their thousands pitched in crooked rows, some of them modest and canvas and quite convincingly Muggle, others betraying themselves entirely, with chimneys and weather vanes and doorbells and small front gardens of hollyhocks that had certainly not been there yesterday. Imagine the smell of wood smoke and frying sausages and cooking fires stirred with wands because it was easier, and children too young for school streaking between the guy ropes on toy broomsticks a foot off the ground. Imagine the salesman walking the rows with trays of rosettes that shrieked the names of players, and figurines of Victor Krum walking sulkily up and down an open palm, and omnioculars that would let you slow the world and see it again. As the light failed, lanterns bloomed in the trees, thousands of them, green and red, until the whole valley glowed like something at the bottom of the sea, and the hum of 100,000 voices rose and settled and rose again like weather. Arthur Weasley was so happy he could hardly speak, delighted by everything and everyone, paying for things with the wrong coins, and if the boy had known that he was standing inside the last good evening of his childhood, perhaps he would have looked longer at the lanterns. He looked anyway. That was something. The match itself was a splendor and a blur, the Bulgarian villa dancing until half the stadium forgot its own name, the Irish leprechauns raining gold that was not really gold, Ireland's chasers moving like one animal, and Krum, that surly, hunched, unlovely boy on the ground who became something else entirely in the air, dropping the length of the pitch in a feint that broke the Bulgarian's rival seeker's nose, and catching the snitch at the end, with his face already streaming blood, catching it to end the game on his own terms even though it meant losing. Ireland won. Krum caught the snitch. Both things were true. It was, in its way, a lesson about dignity in defeat, and nobody in that stadium thought about it for more than a minute, because they were all singing. And then, in the deep of the night, the singing stopped. It began as a different kind of noise, screaming rather than cheering, and the sound of tense tearing, and by the time they were out in the open, there was a crowd of masked and hooded figures marching through the campsite with their wands up, and above them, turning slowly in the air like puppets on invisible strings, the Muggle caretaker and his wife and their 2 children, hoisted and spun for sport while the marchers laughed underneath. The Weasleys ran for the wood with everyone else. In the crush and the dark Harry lost his wand out of his pocket and did not notice. And later, when the marchers had scattered and the ministry wizards were shouting at one another among the trampled fires, something rose over the wood, a colossal skull made of green stars, with a serpent coming out of its mouth like a tongue, hanging there in the black sky and shining. It was quiet, that image. That was the terrible thing about it. It made no sound at all, and yet every witch and wizard old enough to remember screamed at the sight of it, because for 13 years it had meant only one thing, and it had not been seen in the sky since. Somebody had cast it with Harry's stolen wand. A little house elf called Winky was found beneath it holding that wand in her small hands, and her master, Bartemius Crouch, a rigid man of rules, dismissed her on the spot for a crime she had not committed, and she wept, and the world moved on, and did not ask why the wand had been where it was. Very few people slept that night. You may, if you like. The rest of the story goes on quite well without you keeping watch. At Hogwarts in September, Dumbledore stood up at the feast and told them that the Triwizard Tournament, dead these 100 years or so, was coming back. 3 schools, 3 champions, 3 tasks, 1 cup, eternal glory, and, because the old tournament had killed enough children to be abandoned, an age line this time, 17 and over only. There was uproar, of course. There was also a new defense against the dark arts teacher, Alastair Moody, a retired Auror with a face like a weathered cliff, a wooden leg, and a great swiveling blue eye that moved independently of the other and saw through wood and stone and the backs of heads. He was frightening and rude and unreasonable, and the students adored him within a week, and in his first lessons he showed them the 3 unforgivable curses, one by one, on a spider, including the one that kills, which he performed in a classroom of 14-year-olds without apology, saying that they had better know what was out there. There was one boy in the room for whom that green light was not a lesson. In late October, the visitors came. Beauxbatons arrived out of the darkening sky in a powder blue carriage the size of a house, drawn by a dozen winged horses as big as elephants, and out of it stepped Madame Olympe Maxime, who was very tall indeed, and dressed entirely in black satin and opals, and a file of shivering students in fine silk. Durmstrang came up out of the lake itself, a mast rising first through the water, then a ship, ghostly and skeletal, dripping, anchoring in the black shallows, and down its plank came Igor Karkaroff, all smiles and fur, and among his boys, to the incoherent joy of half the castle, Victor Krum. The goblet of fire was a rough wooden cup full of white-blue flame, set in the entrance hall inside a thin golden age line, and for 24 hours the school fed it names on scraps of parchment. Fred and George Weasley took an aging potion and tried it, and were thrown backwards, and grew identical long white beards, which is the sort of thing that happens when you attempt to fool an object older and cleverer than you are. On Halloween, the flames turned red and spat the names out. Victor Krum for Durmstrang, Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons, Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, a decent, handsome, well-liked boy, a Hufflepuff, the sort of person nobody could find a reason to dislike, and the hall went up like a bonfire for him. And then the goblet, which should have finished, went red again and coughed out one more piece of parchment, and Dumbledore caught it and read a 4th name, and the name was Harry Potter. Nobody believed him. That was the whole of that autumn, and it is worth sitting with, gently, because it hurt more than the dragons did. The school decided, with the swiftness of crowds, that he had found a way to cheat his way into a tournament he had never wanted, for glory he had never asked for, and they wore badges saying so. Badges Draco Malfoy had made. That flashed between supporting Cedric and insulting Harry, and the whole castle wore them, laughing, and the laughing followed him down every corridor. Rita Skeeter of the Daily Prophet cornered him in a broom cupboard with a quill that wrote whatever it liked and printed a great deal of tender nonsense about his tragic orphaned tears. none of which he had said. And worst of all, and quietly, Ron Weasley, sixth son, hand-me-down robes. A boy who had spent 3 years standing just behind the most famous child in Britain, decided that Harry had done it and not told him, and stopped speaking to him. Hermione went back and forth between them like a tired diplomat. Harry ate at the end of the table. It is a strange loneliness being surrounded by 1,000 people, all of whom know your name. The first task was dragons. Hagrid, who could not help himself, took him down to the paddock in the dark to see them, 4 of them chained and roaring in a pit of firelight, and among them a Hungarian horntail, black and spined and unspeakable, which was, of course, the one he drew. He told Cedric, because Cedric was the only champion who did not know, and it did not seem fair. And then, on a cold November morning, in an arena packed with everyone he had ever met, a boy of 14 walked out to face a nesting mother dragon with nothing but a piece of wood in his hand, and did the only thing he was truly good at. He called for his broom, and he flew. Round the stands and up over the ridge and out into open air, and the horntail came after him tethered and furious, and he turned inside her and dropped, and took the golden egg, and the crowd, which had spent 2 months despising him, forgot to despise him. Afterwards, in the champion's tent, Ron came in with his face all wrong, and could not manage an apology, and did not need to, because Harry had already forgiven him somewhere over the second corner. Friendship at that age repairs itself in silence. Winter came down over the castle, and with it the Yule Ball, and with the ball a fresh species of misery entirely unrelated to dragons. He was a champion. Champions opened the dance. Therefore he had to ask a girl, and the asking undid him more thoroughly than the horntail. He wanted to ask Cho Chang, and delayed, and when he finally did, she was already going with Cedric Diggory, and was kind about it, which was worse. He went with Parvati Patil. Ron went with her sister Padma, in maroon dress robes with moldering lace at the cuffs that he tried to remove with a knife, and spent the evening in a slow simmer, because Hermione Granger came down the marble staircase on the arm of Victor Crumb, with her hair smooth and her robes periwinkle blue, unrecognizable and entirely herself, and Ron discovered all at once, and far too late, a fact about his own heart that he had no vocabulary for. The great hall was silver and white with frost and ice sculptures and hundreds of garlands of mistletoe and ivy. And there were tiny fairies glimmering in the rose bushes outside, and real snow falling from the ceiling and vanishing before it touched anyone. And in the gardens, Hagrid told Madame Maxime, in a rumbling confidential murmur, that his mother had been a giantess, and was terribly wounded when she refused to admit that hers had been too. The evening ended, as such evenings often do, in a shouting match on a staircase between 2 people who could not say what they meant, and Hermione went up to bed in tears with her shoes in her hand, and the snow kept falling in the windows, and none of it mattered at all in the shape of the year, and all of it was the ordinary business of being 14. Let that be the warm part of the story. Hold on to the mistletoe and the frost and the fairy lights a moment longer. The golden egg screamed when opened, until Cedric, repaying a debt, suggested he open it underwater, and in the prefect's bathroom, in a pool the size of a swimming bath full of scented foam, with moaning myrtle drifting through the taps, he put his head under and heard voices singing that an hour was all he had, and that they had taken something he would sorely miss. The second task was the Black Lake in February. Dobby the house elf, who loved him inconveniently and utterly, brought him a slimy gray ball of gillyweed at the last possible moment, and he swallowed it and threw himself in, and his throat split into gills, and his hands and feet went webbed, and the cold weed dark closed over him and became, suddenly, home. Down he went through forests of black waving weed and plains of silt, past the merpeople's village of rough stone houses with Grindelows watching from the murk, to a great statue of a merperson, where 4 people floated bound and sleeping in the green gloom, Ron and Hermione, and Krum's Hermione and Fleur's little sister Gabrielle, all of them hostages, all of them safe in a way nobody had bothered to tell him. He freed Ron, and then he would not leave, because Fleur had been driven back by Grindelows and had not come, and he would not leave an 8-year-old child tied to a statue at the bottom of a lake on the assumption that somebody, eventually, would. It cost him the time. He came up last, with 2, and the judges, who understood perfectly well what they were looking at, gave him second place for it. Not for skill. For the other thing. Spring was uneasy. Bartemius Crouch, that Iron Man of the Ministry, stopped appearing at work, and then came stumbling out of the forbidden forest one night in the dark, filthy and raving, talking to a tree as though it were his secretary, apologizing to his dead son, warning in his lucid seconds of terrible things, and begging to see Dumbledore. Harry ran for help. When he came back with Dumbledore, Crouch was gone, and Krum lay stunned in the leaves, and nobody ever saw Barty Crouch alive again. There was a shape moving under the surface of that whole year, and no one could see it. The third task, in June, was a maze grown out of the Quidditch pitch, hedges 20 feet high, silver in the starlight, with narrow paths between them and cold mist along the ground. The champions went in by their scores, Harry and Cedric first. Inside, the hedges swallowed sound, and the world reduced itself to a corridor of leaves and the small red glow of a wand tip. There were things in there: a blast-ended scroot, a sphinx with a riddle, a boggart pretending to be a dementor. And there were worse things than creatures, because Fleur was attacked and left behind, and Krum came round a corner with his eyes strangely blank and put the Cruciatus curse on Cedric, and Harry stopped him, and Krum was carried away stunned, with the imperious curse still fogging his mind. So the 2 Hogwarts boys came, from different directions, to the same last clearing, where the Triwizard Cup stood glowing on a plinth. They argued about it, in the mild, embarrassed way of 2 decent people each trying to give the other a prize. And then they decided, because they had helped each other all year and it seemed the right end to it, to take it together, and reached out at the same moment, and touched it. And it was a portkey. It set them down in a graveyard in the dark, in a place neither of them knew, among yew trees and leaning headstones, with a church and a hill and the black windows of a great house above. A figure came out of the dark, carrying something like a baby wrapped in robes, and a high cold voice gave an order, and there was a rush of green light, and Cedric Diggory was dead before he understood he was in danger. 17 years old, kind, a good flyer, well loved by his father, killed as an afterthought, because he was standing there. There is nothing in this story sadder than the smallness of it. Harry was dragged to a headstone bearing the name Tom Riddle and bound to it by a marble angel's grip, and made to watch while Peter Pettigrew brewed the thing he had come to brew, bone taken from the father's grave beneath his feet, given unknowing, flesh cut from the servant's own right hand, given willingly, with a scream, and blood forced from the enemy's arm, taken by force. And out of the boiling cauldron rose Lord Voldemort, whole again, white and thin and red-eyed, with slits for nostrils, standing in the world in a body for the first time in 14 years. He called them then pressing the dark mark on Pettigrew's arm, and they came, cracking into the air one by one in their masks and hoods, kneeling in a circle among the graves, and he walked the circle and named their absences and their cowardice with terrible mildness. He wanted Harry to be seen. He wanted witnesses. So he untied him and returned his wand and made him bow and made him dance under the Cruciatus, and then, because he was proud and it was to be a duel, he let him stand up and raise his wand. The two wands, when the curses met, would not fight each other. They were brothers, their cores taken from the same phoenix, and the spells locked in a thread of golden light that lifted them both off the ground and enclosed them in a dome of song. Down that thread, out of the killing wand, came echoes, Cedric, asking to be taken home, an old Muggle caretaker, a woman from the ministry, and then, last and slow and gentle, a young woman who told him to hold on, and a young man who told him his mother was coming and that he must get ready to run. His parents, made of light and memory, standing between him and the thing that had killed them, buying him a few seconds the way they had once bought him a lifetime. He broke the connection and ran, and caught Cedric's cold hand and summoned the cup and was gone. He came back onto the lawn in the noise of the crowd, lying across a dead boy, howling that he was back, and the last thing that happened to him that night was that his own teacher led him kindly away, because Alistair Moody was not Moody at all, but Barty Crouch's son, who had never died, who had been smuggled out of Azkaban and hidden under his father's roof and freed at last, who had drunk polyjuice all year from a hip flask and put Harry's name in the goblet and steered him through every task like a stone rolling downhill to that graveyard. He was unmasked and questioned under Veritaserum and given away by his own tongue, and it did not bring Cedric back. At the leaving feast, Dumbledore stood before a hall hung in black and did the simplest and bravest thing available to him. He said Cedric's name, and he said how he had died, and he said who had killed him, plainly, without softening it, and asked them all to remember a good boy, and to remember that the choice ahead of them would be between what was right and what was easy. Cornelius Fudge would not have it. The Minister for Magic listened to the same evidence and chose, because the alternative was unbearable, to believe none of it, and the ministry closed its eyes and put its hands over its ears, and the summer that followed was quiet and sunlit and full of a lie. And so Harry went back to Little Whinging with the thing nobody would admit sitting in his chest, and the world went on watering its gardens, and there was one more year waiting for him, in which the danger would not be a dragon or a maze at all, but the slow, ordinary refusal of grown people to look. Sleep now. He is only 14, and the summer is warm, and none of that starts tonight. The summer after the third task came slowly, and it came in silence. Harry had returned to Privet Drive with the memory of a graveyard still folded somewhere behind his eyes, and the world outside Little Whinging seemed to have decided that nothing had happened at all. The days were long and hot and empty. He lay in the flower bed beneath the sitting room window with his ear turned toward the news, listening for a name that never came. He wrote letters to Ron and to Hermione and got back only the same careful, apologetic nothings, and each nothing was heavier than the last. He watered the begonias because his aunt told him to. He lay awake in a small room with the window open and the smell of cut grass drifting in, and he waited, and no one told him anything, and the not telling became its own kind of weather. You know how a summer like that feels. The heat presses down and the hours don't move, and the mind, left alone with itself, begins to circle. Harry grew thin and sharp-tempered and Dudley's gang drifted through the estate in the evenings, and one night, walking home under a sky the color of a bruise, the light in the world went out. It was not a normal darkness. The stars vanished, the street lamps died, and the little concrete underpass filled with a cold that Harry knew in his bones before he knew it in his mind. 2 dementors, in Surrey, in an alleyway that smelled of rain and old chip papers. He fought them with his wand and with a memory, and a great silver stag burst out of the tip of it and drove them away. And then, still shaking, he learned that he had broken the law of a ministry that had rather he had not survived at all. Mrs. Figg came clattering along in her carpet slippers, and it turned out that the mad old cat lady on the corner had been watching over him for years. And that was the first thread of the true shape of things. Then came the owls. One after another, expulsion and reprieve again, and then, at last, the advance guard. They arrived in his bedroom at midnight, a strange and gentle collection of people. Mad-Eye Moody with his rolling blue eye, Remus Lupin looking shabby and kind, a young witch called Tonks, with hair the color of bubblegum, who knocked things over and did not mind. They flew north over dark fields and sleeping towns, and Harry felt the cold air stream past him and thought that he was, at last, going somewhere. Where they went was a house that did not exist. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, unfolded itself between numbers 11 and 13 like a card slipped into a deck, and inside it was dark and narrow and full of dust. It had been the house of the Blacks, and it had never forgiven anyone for leaving. There were portraits on the stairs and elf heads mounted on the wall, and a doorbell that woke the shrieking canvas of Sirius's mother. And there was Creature, muttering, ancient, hating them all quietly as he shuffled from room to room. It smelled of damp and old velvet, and in the middle of that gloom, at a long kitchen table under a hanging lamp, sat the Order of the Phoenix, the people who believed him. That was the thing that mattered. They believed him. Molly Weasley fed them all and worried at the edges of everything. Sirius, who had been given his freedom only in the sense that a bird is given a larger cage, prowled his childhood home and drank too much and lit up like a boy whenever Harry came into the room. Harry and Ron and Hermione spent the last days of August scrubbing doxies out of the curtains and arguing over a tapestry of a family tree with holes burnt in it where the unforgivable relatives had been. And Harry, who had spent the summer furious at his friends, found that his fury had nowhere to go once he was among them, and dissolved slowly, the way frost goes off a window when the sun finally reaches it. The Ministry, meanwhile, had chosen its story. Cornelius Fudge could not bear the thought of Voldemort returned, because a returned Voldemort meant a year of terror and the end of the comfortable world, and so he decided instead that the boy who said so was lying, and that Dumbledore was an old man scheming for his job. The Daily Prophet took up the work with enthusiasm. Day after day, in small barbed asides, Harry became a joke, a disturbed child, an attention seeker with a scar. It is a peculiar cruelty, that one. Not a curse, not a blow, just a great many people, over a great many mornings, being told with a smile that you are not real. His disciplinary hearing was moved without warning to an early hour in a deep courtroom, and Arthur Weasley walked him down through the Ministry's lower corridors, and Harry stood before the full Wizengamot for the crime of saving his own life. Dumbledore arrived, calm as a stone in a river, and produced Mrs. Figg, and the charges came apart. But Dumbledore did not look at Harry once, not once, in all that hour, and Harry went home cleared and hollow, carrying a small cold question he could not put down. So, he came to Hogwarts in the autumn to find the castle unchanged and everything inside it altered. There was a new face at the staff table, a small woman in pink, with a soft voice and a girlish cough, who wore a black velvet bow in her hair and smiled the way a toad smiles. Dolores Umbridge had been sent by the ministry, and she interrupted the start of term feast to say, in a great many gentle words, that the ministry intended to take Hogwarts in hand. What followed was a slow lesson in a particular kind of evil, the kind that never raises its voice. She taught defense against the dark arts by making them read a book and forbidding them to lift their wands, because a ministry that insisted there was nothing to fear could not permit children to learn how to fight it. Harry argued with her in that first lesson and said Cedric's name aloud in a bright classroom, and she sent him to detention with a smile as sweet as sugar. The detentions were not what he expected. There was no shouting. There was a small office hung with lace and kitten plates that mewed at each other, and a table, and a chair, and a black quill with no inkpot. She asked him, kindly, to write out that he must not tell lies. He wrote it, and the words appeared on the parchment in a dark red, and at the same moment the skin on the back of his hand opened in the same shape, and the ink was his own, line after line, evening after evening. She sipped tea and let the kittens mew, and Harry, being who he was, refused to make a sound, and the words on his hand faded a little each night and were written again the next, until they stopped fading and stayed there, thin and white, a sentence carved into him that he would carry for the rest of his life. She kept climbing. Educational decree followed educational decree, each pinned up in the entrance hall in a neat gold frame, each one taking a little more. Student organizations were banned. Teachers were forbidden to speak of anything but their subjects. She was made High Inquisitor and sat at the back of lessons with a clipboard, and inspected Professor Trelawney until the woman stood weeping in the entrance hall, with her trunks around her, and it was only Dumbledore who kept her in the castle at all. Umbridge took the Gryffindor Quidditch team from Harry and banned him from flying, for life, and his firebolt was locked away in her office. Piece by piece, quietly, with paperwork, the school was being taken apart, and there was almost nothing in it that a wand could be pointed at. And so, in a dim upstairs room in the Hogshead 1 Hogsmeade weekend, with the barman glaring through his spectacles, Hermione did the sensible and unthinkable thing and suggested that if no one would teach them, Harry would. He didn't want to. He said he had only ever been lucky and frightened. But they came anyway, 20-odd of them, Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, signing their names on a list, and they called themselves Dumbledore's Army, because the name annoyed the right people. They met in a room on the 7th floor that only appeared when you needed it, opposite a tapestry of a troll being taught ballet, a room that shaped itself into exactly what they had come for: cushions on the floor, shelves of books on defensive magic, dark curtains, warm lamps. Harry taught them disarming and stunning and shield charms, and something happened in that room which had not happened to him before. He was good at it. He found that he liked the moment when someone's face changed because a spell had finally worked. He watched Neville Longbottom, who had been laughed at for 5 years, get better and better and better, with a set jaw and no explanation. And when at last he taught them the Patronus, the room filled with light. A silver hare, an otter, a great cat, small wisps of brightness stumbling out of wand tips and gathering strength, wheeling around the lamps and passing through the walls and coming back. Adults teaching adults, children teaching children, all of them laughing without quite knowing why, because a Patronus is made of happiness, and making one give some of it back. Cho Chang's swan flew above them. Harry stood in the middle of that dim room among all that soft-moving silver and thought that it was, perhaps, the best thing he had ever done. There was Cho, too, and that was its own gentle awkwardness. She was lovely and she was grieving, and Harry did not know what to do with either. They went to Madame Puddifoot's on Valentine's Day, into a fog of cherubs and confetti, and it ended badly and sadly, because she wanted to talk about Cedric and Harry wanted, very much, not to. They tried, in the way of two people who each needed something the other could not give, and it came apart quietly, and afterwards there was mostly just a kind of tiredness where the wanting had been. Meanwhile, the dreams had begun. Night after night, Harry walked a dark corridor toward a plain black door he could never open, and he woke with his scar burning. Dumbledore, who still would not look at him, arranged for him to learn occlumency, the sealing of the mind, and the teacher he arranged was Severus Snape. They were the worst lessons of his life. In Snape's dungeon, with the jars glinting on the shelves, Harry was made to stand still while a man who despised him walked through his memories, and the memories that came were the ones he would never have chosen: Dudley's gang, the cupboard, Cedric's body on the wet grass. Snape told him to clear his mind, which is an easy instruction and an almost impossible act, and Harry did not practice, not properly, because the corridor and the door had begun to feel less like a nightmare and more like an invitation, and the lessons meant to close his mind held it open instead, and each week it opened a little wider. Before that, in the deep of winter, something else had come through. Harry dreamed he was long and low and gliding across a dark floor toward a man dozing in a chair, and the man was Arthur Weasley, and Harry was the snake, and the fangs went in. He woke screaming, and it was true, and because he woke and told them, Arthur was found in time and lived. That was the first mercy of the connection. He lay in the hospital wing at St. Mungo's, in bandages that would not stay on, and the family gathered around the bed, and Harry stood at the edge of it and wondered, in a small dark voice, what exactly he was, that he had watched through those eyes and not entirely minded. And in the spring, at the end of one occlumency lesson, Snape was called away, and Harry, alone in the office, saw the silvery contents of a pensieve moving in the stone basin and leaned in. He fell into a summer afternoon by the lake after an examination, with the grass full of students and the light warm and gold. And there was his father, 15 years old, handsome, laughing, ruffling his hair for the benefit of anyone watching. And there was Sirius, beautiful and bored. And there was a boy with lank black hair, alone with his books, and James Potter went for him for no reason at all, except that he existed, and hung him upside down in the air while everyone laughed. Lily Evans told them to stop, and James enjoyed even that. Harry watched his father be cruel to Snape, simply because he could, and understood, standing in that gold afternoon, why a man had hated him on sight for 5 years. He came up out of the pensieve with Snape's hand around his arm, and the lesson ended forever, and something in Harry's picture of the world had shifted and would never quite shift back. Later, Sirius and Lupin told him, gently, that James had grown out of it, that people are not finished at 15, that his mother had come to love him for good reasons. It helped. It did not undo the afternoon. Then, near the end, the Da was betrayed. Marietta Edgecombe, frightened, told Umbridge, and Hermione's Jinx wrote the word across her face in purple pustules, and Umbridge came up to the 7th floor with the inquisitorial squad at her heels. It should have been the end of Harry. But Dumbledore stood up in his office in front of Fudge and said, calmly, that it had been his organization and his plot, and he took the whole weight of it onto himself, and then, before they could arrest him, he left in a blaze of light with Fawkes, and the school was Umbridge's. The last stretch of that year had a strange, stretched quality, the way things do before a storm. Umbridge in the headmaster's office, unable to make the gargoyle move. Fred and George Weasley, leaving in a magnificent, unrepentant riot of fireworks and a portable swamp, flying out of the front doors into the sunlight and their own shop. And through it all, the OWL's long silent hours in the great hall with enchanted quills and the summer sun coming through the high windows, and Harry writing about giant wars and shield charms and trying, for whole minutes together, to think about nothing else. It was during the History of Magic exam, in that drowsy heat, with his head on his arms and the room quiet around him, that Harry saw Sirius on the floor of a long dark room and Voldemort standing over him, and heard, or thought he heard, that his godfather was being tortured for something he would not give up. There was no way to check. The fireplaces were watched. Umbridge caught them at hers. Creature had lied. Everything was wrong and everything was urgent, and Harry, who had never learned to sit still while someone he loved was hurt, decided to go. Umbridge dragged him toward the forbidden forest and toward a curse she should not have been able to use, and Hermione led her instead into the trees and to the centaurs. And Grop came crashing out of the dark, and she was carried away into the leaves. And so, in the long blue dusk of a summer evening, 6 of them walked out to the edge of the forest, and Harry called the Thestrals. They came drifting out between the trees on great leathery wings, skeletal and black and strangely gentle, and only Harry and Luna and Neville could see them at all, and the others climbed onto the backs of nothing and held tight. They rose into a sky going violet at the edges and flew south over darkening England toward London, with the wind streaming past, and Luna, who was afraid of very little, rode her invisible horse quite happily. Hold that image a moment. 6 children, 6 unseen horses, a warm summer night, the whole sky turning. The Department of Mysteries was cold and echoing. A circular room of identical doors that spun and reset itself. And beyond it, the Hall of Prophecy, a vast dim cathedral of shelves stretching away into the dark, rank upon rank of small dusty glass spheres, each one glowing faintly with its own blue light. Each one a fragment of somebody's fate. They walked down row 97 under all that cold blue, and Sirius was not there, and there was only a sphere with Harry's own name on the label. And when he picked it up, the Death Eaters stepped out from between the shelves, and Lucius Malfoy explained, unhurriedly, that it had all been a lie built inside Harry's head to bring him here, because only the ones the prophecy named could lift it from its shelf. What followed was chaos in the dark, shelves crashing down in a cascade of breaking glass and whispering ghosts, corridors of brains and clocks, and a room where time ran strangely, spells flying, children fighting grown murderers, and, for a while, holding, Hermione fell silently, and Harry thought she was dead. Neville fought on, with a broken nose and a broken wand, and never once considered stopping. And then the order came, and the room with the archway filled with light and noise, and Sirius fought beside his godson, laughing, alive in a way he had not been all year, and Bellatrix Lestrange sent a jet of red light at his chest, and he was falling, and it took so long, and he went backwards through the ragged veil hanging in that stone arch, still with the ghost of a laugh on his face, and the curtain swayed and settled, and he did not come out. That is the whole of it, and there is no more to tell about it, and that is exactly what could not be borne. There was no body, there was no wound. There was a doorway and a piece of old cloth moving slightly, and the person on the other side of it was simply, completely gone. Harry tried to go after him, and Lupin held him, arms around his chest, telling him quietly that there was nothing there, that he was gone, and Harry did not believe it, and then began, slowly, to believe it. He had had a godfather for 2 years. He had had a home offered to him for 2 years. It had been the best thing in his life, and now it was behind a curtain. He chased Bellatrix into the atrium and tried to use a curse he did not have the cruelty to mean, and she laughed at him for it, and told him that righteous anger is not enough. And then Voldemort was there, in the middle of the Ministry of Magic at last, and so was Dumbledore, and the two of them fought among the Golden Fountain and the fireplaces, while the statues came alive, and the water rose in walls, and the whole hall filled with fire and water and light. It was the duel of two men who had run out of ways to avoid each other, and it was terrible, and Dumbledore never once looked as if he had lost. So Voldemort took the other road. He slid into Harry's mind and coiled there, and let Harry feel what it was to be him, and told Dumbledore to kill the boy if he wanted to be rid of the monster. And Harry, on the floor, burning, thought that he would like to die if it meant he could see Sirius again, and that thought, that grief, that love, was the thing Voldemort could not stay inside. It scalded him. He was driven out of the boy by the sheer unbearable warmth of what the boy felt, and he fled, and the Ministry saw him go, and the year of lies ended in a single second in front of 100 witnesses. Afterwards, in the quiet of the headmaster's office, with the portraits pretending to sleep and the silver instruments ticking, Dumbledore told him at last. He explained why he had not looked at him all year, which was that Voldemort might have been watching through him. He explained the prophecy that before Harry's birth a seer had spoken of a boy born, as July died to parents who had thrice defied him, that the Dark Lord would mark that boy as his equal and give him a power the Dark Lord did not know, and that in the end neither of them could truly live while the other survived. Voldemort had heard only half of it, and by acting on that half had made it true, and had chosen Harry himself out of 2 possible boys, and had marked him. So it would come, one day, to the 2 of them. And Harry wrecked the office, and Dumbledore let him, and stood there while a boy broke his belongings and screamed that he had had enough. And then the old man said, very quietly, that it was his fault, that he had known all this for years and had said nothing, because he had grown fond of Harry, because he had cared more about Harry's happiness than about Harry's readiness, and because an old man who had made a great many hard decisions had discovered, too late, that he could not bear to make this one. He had wanted the boy to have a childhood. He had wanted him to be happy. And that wanting had cost Sirius his life. And Dumbledore said so plainly, and did not defend himself, and Harry found that his anger had nowhere to stand. The rest was gentle and gray. The Ministry apologized in print, and fudge fell, and the prophet printed the truth as loudly as it had printed the lies. Umbridge was carried out of the hospital wing flinching at hoofbeats. Term ended. The Weasleys and Tonks and Moody met him at King's Cross and had a quiet word with the Dursleys about how he was to be treated, and Harry went back to Privet Drive for one more summer, carrying the words on the back of his hand, and a hole where a godfather had been, and something else too, small and stubborn. The knowledge that people had followed him in a dim room full of silver light, and that the thing which had saved him in the end was not a spell at all. That was the 5th year. The war was true now, and everyone knew it, and the 6th year would begin with a different minister, a different sky, and an old man with a blackened hand who had finally decided to tell him everything. There is a particular hush that settles over a house at the end of a long summer, and it was in that hush that Harry Potter waited, 16 years old, for the world to tell him what it had already decided. The 5th year had ended in a room full of falling veils and a prophecy shattered into dust on a stone floor, and Sirius had gone through an archway and had not come back, and Harry had carried that with him out of the ministry and onto the train and into the small hot bedroom on Privet Drive, where he lay awake listening to the sprinklers on the lawns and the distant hum of a country that no longer had the luxury of not believing, because the ministry had finally admitted it. After a year of denials, after all the sneering headlines and the pink cardigans and the careful, cowardly insistence that everything was fine, the Minister for Magic had stood in the wreckage of his own department and seen with his own eyes a tall, thin figure with red eyes, and that had been the end of Cornelius Fudge. The prophet turned overnight from mockery to warning, printing safety advice on its front page as though a sensible checklist could keep a person alive, and Rufus Scrimgeour took the office with his lion's mane of gray hair and his limp and his hunger to be seen doing something. And in the Muggle world, which knew nothing, the bridges came down, and the fogs came in, and the weather went wrong, and the people said it was terrorists, or freak storms, or bad luck, and they were not entirely wrong about the last one. So the war was open now, and that was the strangest part. Listener, the part that nobody quite says aloud, that when the war came at last into the daylight, everyone still went back to school. The letters arrived as they always did. The book lists were printed. Trunks were packed. It was as though the castle itself insisted on continuing, on ringing its bells and lighting its candles and serving its enormous dinners, because to stop would be to admit that the thing outside had won already. Harry went to Diagon Alley and found half the shop fronts boarded and the rest hung with those grim purple posters, and in the middle of that gray street, the Weasley twins had opened a shop like a firework going off, orange and violet and absurd, and it was the most defiant thing in England. Dumbledore came for him himself. That summer, walking up the garden path of number 4, as though he had every right to, and Harry noticed at once the thing he would not stop noticing all year. The headmaster's right hand was blackened and dead-looking, the fingers shriveled and dark, as though they had been burned from within. Dumbledore turned it away, made light of it, said only that the story was a long one and a merry one, and not for that evening, and Harry, who had learned that year to be angry, and had also learned that anger changed nothing, let it go. They went that night to a village in the west, and persuaded an old man out of hiding, Horace Slughorn, once master of potions, who had spent the year in other people's houses pretending to be an armchair, and who was flattered and frightened, and finally, gently, flattered again into coming back to teach. And that was how Harry Potter's 6th year began, with a new professor who collected people the way other men collect stamps, who liked to know the famous and the promising and the well-connected, and who looked at Harry with the delighted appraising eye of a man who has just been handed the centerpiece of his collection. Slughorn taught potions now, which meant that Severus Snape at last had the post he had wanted for 16 years, defense against the dark arts. And the years turning had that odd symmetry to it, everything sliding one place along the shelf. It also meant, by a small accident of grades and timetables, that Harry ended up in a potions class he had never expected to attend, without a book. Borrowing an old copy from the cupboard at the back. It was a battered thing, its spine broken, its pages soft with age, and every margin of it was covered in small, cramped handwriting, crossings out, corrections, better ways, timings altered, ingredients crushed instead of cut. On the inside of the back cover, in the same hand, someone had written that this book was the property of the half-blood prince. And here is the gentle, unexpected pleasure of that autumn. Harry followed those notes, and the potions came out right, not passably. Perfectly. He, who had been mediocre at potions for 5 years under a teacher who despised him, was suddenly the best in the room. And Slughorn beamed at him and said he had his mother's gift, and Hermione went quiet and tight-lipped with the particular unhappiness of someone watching a friend win by a route she cannot approve of. Harry knew it was borrowed brilliance. He knew, and he could not make himself care, because it is a rare and sweet thing to be good at something for the first time, and he had never been given very many sweet things. There was a bottle of Felix Felicis for the winner of that first lesson, liquid luck, molten gold moving in its glass like a school of fish, and Harry won it and put it away, and did not yet know what it was for. But something else had begun that autumn, and it lived in Harry like a splinter. On the train, hidden under his invisibility cloak, in the luggage rack, he had watched Draco Malfoy boast to a compartment of half-listening Slytherins, and there had been something new in the boy, not swagger, but the brittle, held-together look of someone carrying a task. Malfoy was thinner that year, and paler, and he was often not where he should have been. He vanished from the Marauders map. He missed Quidditch. Harry became certain in the bones, in the way he was certain about very few things, that Draco Malfoy had been given a job by Voldemort, and that he was trying to do it inside the castle, and nobody else believed him. Ron and Hermione were tired of hearing it. Dumbledore listened, and did not act, and Harry followed him through the corridors of that year, like a man following a light on the water. What Harry did not know, and what the story knows, is that on a dark street in a poor town at the very beginning of it all, Draco's mother had gone to Severus Snape and begged him, and that Snape had knelt and let a thread of fire bind his wrist and had sworn to watch the boy, to protect him. And when Narcissa's sister pressed him with a third condition, sharp as a needle, to do the thing himself if the boy could not. Bellatrix's face in the firelight had been full of triumph and disbelief. Snape's had been unreadable, as it always was. And through that year, at intervals, a note would come to Gryffindor Tower in a thin slanted hand, and Harry would climb to the circular office with its whirring silver instruments and its sleeping portraits, and there would be no wand work, no counter curses, none of the lessons he had imagined. There was only a stone basin with a silvery substance moving in it like breath on cold glass, and an old man with a ruined hand who wanted, above all things, for a boy to understand. They went down into other people's memories together. They saw a filthy shack in a hollow by a Muggle village, where the last of Salazar Slytherin's line lived on nothing but pride. Old Marvolo Gaunt, with his ring and his locket and his boasting. His son Morphin, who spoke to snakes and nailed them to the door. And his daughter Merope, who was so battered down by them both that she could barely hold a wand straight. And they saw what became of her, how she watched a handsome muggle ride past on the lane. How, when her father and brother were taken away to Azkaban, she used what she had. A potion, most likely, brewed by a girl who was not gifted at very much else, and how the young man married her and left with her, and how the village said what villages say. And then, at some point, she stopped. Perhaps she hoped he had come to love her. Perhaps she simply could not bear to go on making him. And he left, and she was alone in London in the snow, pregnant, and she sold the last treasure of her line, Slytherin's locket, for 10 galleons to a shop that knew exactly what it was worth. And she walked into a muggle orphanage on the last night of the year and asked that her son be called Tom, after his father, and Marvolo, after hers, and that he might look like his father. And then she died, having chosen, when she could have chosen otherwise, not to live. Dumbledore told Harry that she could have survived. She had magic. She had a child. She simply would not, and they saw the orphanage, the clean scrubbed hallways, the gray stone, and a small dark-haired boy sitting on a bed who had already learned that he was different and had already decided that different meant better. He did not want a friend. He did not want a family. He wanted only to know what he could do, and he had made the other children afraid of him, and he had taken small things from them and hidden them in a box, not because he wanted them, but because he wanted to have taken them. He had led 2 of them into a cave by the sea and brought them out changed and silent. When Dumbledore, young and auburn-haired then, told him he was a wizard, the boy did not weep with joy. He asked whether his father had been one. He said that he could make things happen without wanting to. And he did not, Dumbledore said afterwards, quietly want to be loved. He had never seen the use of it. They saw him grown a little, charming, immaculate, gathering a knot of admirers who followed him and would one day take a name. They saw him asking a potions master a question at a fireside, late, after too much brandy, and here the memory turned to fog, and a voice boomed out of it, and the whole thing curdled, because Horace Slughorn had gone into his own head and torn the truth out and stuffed something soft and false in its place, and had carried the lie around for 50 years like a stone in his shoe. Dumbledore asked Harry to get the true one, not to demand it, not to steal it, to be Lily Evans's son in front of a man who had loved Lily Evans, and to ask. It took Harry months, and in the end it took the little bottle of liquid gold. On the evening he drank it, everything simply lined up. He went out when he should have stayed in, and buried a giant spider by the edge of the forest, with a weeping half-giant on one side and a tipsy old professor on the other. And afterwards, in a warm little office thick with the smell of wine, he said the thing that had to be said, and Slughorn's face crumpled, and he gave the memory over with the shame of a man handing across the worst hour of his life. In it, the boy Tom Riddle asked, ever so lightly, as though it were a matter of academic curiosity, about a piece of magic called a Horcrux, and Slughorn, flattered, careless, explained that a person could split their soul by an act of murder and hide the fragment in an object, and so be anchored to the world even if their body were destroyed. And the boy asked whether it could be done more than once. Whether 7 being the most powerfully magical number, might be possible, and Slughorn, appalled at last, told him to forget it. He had not forgotten it. Dumbledore had suspected it for years, and now he knew, and now Harry knew, that Voldemort had not been made immortal by one dark act, but by many, that he had scattered himself into objects and hidden them like a jackdaw, and that until every one of them was found, and destroyed, he could not truly die. The diary Harry had stabbed in the Chamber of Secrets had been one. The ring, Marvolo Gaunt's ring, which Dumbledore had found in the ruin of that shack and destroyed at a cost he never fully described, had been another. And that was the story of the Blackened Hand. The merry story he had never got round to telling. The year went on around these lessons. Ordinary and not ordinary. Katie Bell touched an opal necklace through a hole in its wrapping on a wet lane back from Hogsmeade and rose into the air with her arms flung wide and her hair whipping and her mouth open in a scream nobody could hear properly in the wind. And she was carried away to St. Mungo's and did not remember who had given it to her. At Christmas, Ron drank a mouthful of oak-matured mead in Slughorn's office and went down choking with foam on his lips, and Harry, moving before he knew he was moving, forced a bezoar between his teeth, a trick out of the margins of a battered book, and so the half-blood prince saved Ron Weasley's life without ever knowing it. Both things had been meant for Dumbledore. Both had been clumsy. Harry said so to anyone who would listen, and named the name, and was told he was obsessed. And yet there was happiness that spring, and it was clean and small and entirely his own. Ginny Weasley had grown up somewhere along the way while Harry was busy elsewhere, and there came a day, after a Quidditch match he had missed, serving detention, only to walk into a common room roaring with victory when he crossed the room without deciding to, and kissed her in front of everyone. And Ron looked at them both and shrugged, and the fire crackled, and that was that. For a few weeks they walked by the lake and sat under the beech tree, and Harry was, for the only sustained stretch of his adolescence, simply and unremarkably content. He remembered it afterwards, the way you remember a warm afternoon, not the events, just the light. There was one thing he never forgave himself for that year. He cornered Malfoy at last in a flooded bathroom, both of them wild, and Malfoy's wand came up, and Harry reached for the first thing in his memory, a spell scrawled in the prince's book with only 2 words beside it, for enemies, and Sectum Sempra tore the other boy open from face to chest and laid him down in an inch of cold water, running red. Harry stood there with his wand shaking, not knowing what he had done, having used a curse he had never troubled to look up, and it was Snape who came and sang the wounds closed, and it was Ginny and Ron who helped him hide the book afterwards in the vast forgotten room of lost things. But the horror stayed. He had not known what the spell would do, and he had used it anyway, and there is no comfortable place to put a fact like that. Then, in June, on a warm evening, Dumbledore asked him to come. They went together to a cliff by the sea where the water heaved black against the rock, and swam and climbed into a fissure, and came at last to an enormous cavern beneath the earth, filled edge to edge with still black water, and in the very center of it, on a small island. A stone basin glowed with a faint, eerie green light that lay over everything, over the water, over the boy's face, over the old man's ruined hand, a green so soft and steady that Harry would remember it for the rest of his life as the color of that night. Dumbledore paid the toll of blood to enter, and worked out the shape of the enchantment the way another man might unpick a knot, and found the boat, and rowed them across. In the basin was a potion, and the locket lay beneath it, and the potion could not be moved or banished or drunk by anything but a person. So Dumbledore drank, and made Harry promise to keep making him drink. Whatever he said, whatever he begged, and Harry kept that promise, goblet after goblet, while the greatest wizard of the age wept and shook and pleaded with someone long dead, and said that it was his fault, that he was sorry, that they should hurt him instead of them, and Harry did not stop, because he had been asked not to, and love sometimes looks exactly like cruelty from the outside. When it was empty, Dumbledore lay still and asked for water, and Harry, half mad with fear, drew water out of the lake, and the lake answered. They came up all around, pale and thin and long-drowned, hundreds of them, the inferi, bodies with white eyes rising, without a sound out of the black, and they took hold of him and pulled him down, and it was fire that saved them, a great lasso of flame from an old man who had found, somewhere, one last full measure of strength. They came out of the cave and into the salt air, and Dumbledore leaned on Harry like a man made of paper, and said, when Harry asked, that he was not afraid, because he was with him. And then they looked up, and over the distant towers of the castle hung a green skull with a serpent for a tongue. Listener, this is the part that must be told softly, because it happened quickly, and it should not be hurried. They flew back. They landed on the astronomy tower, and Dumbledore, hearing footsteps, froze Harry where he stood beneath the cloak with a wordless spell, so that Harry could not move and could not speak and could only watch. And Draco Malfoy burst through the door and disarmed him. That was the task, you see. That was what the boy had been carrying all year, why he was thin, why he vanished, why Harry had been right and it had done no good at all to be right. He had been ordered to kill Albus Dumbledore, and had mended a broken cabinet to let the Death Eaters in, and now he stood at the top of the tower, with the old man slumped against the ramparts, and his own wand shaking in his hand. And he could not do it. That is the thing worth keeping. Dumbledore spoke to him kindly, without fear, called him by his first name, told him that he was not a killer, that the school could hide him, that his mother could be protected, that there was still time to come over to the right side, and the boy's wand drooped, and something in his face began to come apart, and for a moment on that high dark tower a 16-year-old was very close to putting the whole thing down. Then others came up the stairs, and there was jeering, and the moment thinned, and then Severus Snape came through the door, and Dumbledore looked at him and said his name, and asked him for something, quietly, and only 2 men in the world knew what was being asked. And Snape's face went hard and blank, and he raised his wand, and the green light took the old man and lifted him back over the ramparts, and he fell, slowly it seemed, all that way down through the summer dark, and came to rest on the grass below the tower, with his half-moon spectacles askew, and his arms flung out, looking, for all the world, as though he had lain down there to rest. Afterwards there was chaos in the corridors, and a battle at the foot of the stairs, and Bill Weasley's face torn by a werewolf, who was not even transformed, and Harry chased Snape across the grounds under the moon, and could not touch him, and screamed at him in the darkness, and got nothing back but the flat statement that he was the half-blood prince, and then he was gone through the gates. But it is the quiet after that stays. The whole castle came out onto the lawn and stood around him, and Hagrid carried him in, and the phoenix sang somewhere in the dark, one long note of grief that everyone who heard it said afterwards had been coming from inside their own chest, and in the days that followed the school did nothing at all. Lessons stopped. The exams were canceled or forgotten. Students sat by the lake in the sun in small silent groups, and nobody knew what to say, and the great hall was full of people not eating. They buried him by the lake. Hundreds came, the ministry, the goblins, the centaurs at the tree line, the merpeople singing something wild and strange up out of the water. Harry sat and heard almost none of the words spoken over the body, and afterwards white flame rose around the table, and, when it cleared, there was a white marble tomb where the body had been, plain and bright against the green, with the lake behind it and the mountains beyond. And it is there still, and it is the most peaceful place in Britain. He ended it with Ginny that afternoon, gently, because he could not bear to give Voldemort anything else to take, and she let him, because she had always understood him better than he understood himself. And there was one thing more. The locket he had nearly died for in the cave that Dumbledore had drained a basin of poison to reach, Harry opened it, at last, and it was not Slytherin's. It was a cheap thing, and inside it was a scrap of parchment, folded small, in a handwriting nobody recognized. Whoever had written it said that they had discovered the secret, that they had stolen the real Horcrux and meant to destroy it as soon as they could, that they faced death in the hope that when Voldemort met his match, he would be mortal again. And it was signed with 3 initials only, R.A.B. So the old man had died for a fake, and somewhere out there, dead or alive, was a stranger who had got there first. Harry told Ron and Hermione, by the lake, that he was not going back to school in September, that there was no point in charms and transfiguration when the thing that had to be done was to find the pieces of a broken soul and destroy them one by one, and they told him, without any fuss at all, that of course they were coming too. And then all 3 of them looked out at the water for a while and said nothing, and the tomb shone white in the sun a little way off, and the giant squid turned over lazily in the shallows, and the Hogwarts Express waited down in the valley to carry them away for the last time. Sleep now. The hunt begins in the morning. He came back from the white tomb by the lake with the taste of salt water and stone dust in his throat, and the summer that followed was the strangest of his life, because it was quiet, and it should not have been. The world was ending slowly, the way a house settles before it falls, and yet the sun still came up over Little Whinging, and the milk still arrived in bottles, and the lawns were mown in the long gold evenings by men who had no idea at all. Harry spent those weeks in the smallest bedroom of number 4, Privet Drive, sorting through 6 years of belongings, and there was a kind of peace in it that he had not expected. The peace of a person who has finally been given a task small enough to finish. He found broken quills and old sweet wrappers and a shard of enchanted mirror that showed him nothing but his own eye, and he packed what mattered and left the rest. And when the Dursleys finally went, driven away by Order members, into a hiding place he would not know the location of, his cousin Dudley stopped in the hall and, in his slow and clumsy way, said the only kind thing he had ever said to Harry, and then the door closed and the house was empty and it was over. That whole long childhood of cupboards and closed doors, over without ceremony, which is how most things end. You may remember the night they came for him. They came in a great awkward flock of brooms and thestrals, 6 of his friends drinking Polyjuice Potion and becoming him, 6 Harry Potters rising into the dark to confuse the hunters, and it was a plan built out of hope and desperation in roughly equal measure. The sky above Surrey filled with black robes and green light, and Hedwig, his first friend, his snowy companion who had carried his letters through every year of his life, died in her cage before he had even reached the coast. Hagrid drove the flying motorbike, and Harry clung to him. And somewhere in that scattered chaos, Mad-Eye Moody fell, that grim, battered old soldier who trusted nothing and no one and had guarded them all so fiercely and there was no body to bury. Only a magical eye that Voldemort's people later took and set into a door as a decoration, which was perhaps the cruelest thing they did that whole year. George Weasley lost an ear to a curse meant for someone else, and made jokes about holes in his head while his mother wept, and one by one they gathered at the burrow and counted themselves and found the count wrong. And that was the beginning. Not a battle, just a long inventory of loss, taken in a kitchen at dawn. And then, because life is stubborn and insists on its small joys even in the worst years, there was a wedding. Bill Weasley married Fleur Delacour in the orchard behind the burrow under a great white marquee, with golden chairs and butterflies among the tent poles, and Fleur's silver hair loose down her back, and Harry drank the strange bright happiness of it through the borrowed face of a red-haired village boy. There was dancing. There was too much champagne. Ron's great-aunt Muriel said appalling things to everyone within reach, and everyone forgave her because she was old and it was a wedding. And in the middle of it all, in the warm blue dark, a silver light came down through the roof of the marquee and stood among the dancers, and it was a lynx, Kingsley Shacklebolt's Patronus, and it spoke in his deep, slow voice and told them that the ministry had fallen, that Scrimgeour was dead, that they were coming. The music stopped, and in the space of about 4 heartbeats the wedding became a scattering. People disapparating in mid-step, chairs overturned, white flowers trodden into the grass, and Harry and Ron and Hermione took hands and turned on the spot and were gone into the night, and they did not come back for a year. They went to ground at number 12, Grimmauld Place, that tall, black, cold house that Sirius had hated, and lived among the dust and the shrunken house elf heads and the shrieking portrait of a dead woman who had never loved anyone. And there, in that unhappiest of houses, they found the year's first real kindness, and it came from the least likely place. Kreacher, the ancient elf, filthy and bitter and cruel-tongued, was made to tell them his story, and it turned out he had one, and it broke them a little. Long ago, the youngest son of the house, Regulus Black, a boy who had joined Voldemort out of pride and family and the sheer stupid glamour of it, had lent his elf to the Dark Lord for an evening, and Voldemort had used Kreacher to test the defenses of a cave by the sea, made him drink a potion of despair, and left him there to die among the drowned dead. Kreacher, being an elf, obeyed his master's order to come home, and came home, and told Regulus what had been done to him. And Regulus Black, 17 or 18 years old, quietly and without telling anyone, went back to that cave himself. He drank the potion himself. He sent his elf away with the real locket, and a fake one left in its place, and an order to destroy the true Horcrux, and then he let the dead hands pull him under the black water. He had no monument. Nobody had ever known. And Kreacher had spent every year since trying and failing to destroy a thing that could not be destroyed by any magic he had, going mad by inches in a house full of ghosts. And when Harry gave him Regulus's fake locket to keep, the old elf wept, and after that there was cooking in that kitchen, and clean sheets, and steak and kidney pie, and the house was still black and cold, but it was no longer quite so lonely. That is what came of one moment of ordinary courtesy. Remember it if you remember nothing else from the whole grim year. The true locket had been stolen from Kreacher by Mundungus Fletcher, and passed on, in a bribe, to Dolores Umbridge, who wore it at her throat as if it were a family heirloom and proof of the pure blood she did not have, while below her in the ministry courtrooms she sent frightened people to prison for the crime of being born. So they went in after it, 3 teenagers under polyjuice in stolen skins, walking through the Ministry of Magic, while a great black statue in the atrium showed muggles crushed under a throne, and they took the locket from her neck in the middle of a trial, and they got out by the skin of their teeth with a frightened woman named Mary Cattermole and the ruin of their hiding place behind them. Because in the scramble of disapparition, a Death Eater's arm came through with them, and Grimmauld Place was lost, and after that they had nowhere at all. And so the tent. Here the story slows, as their year slowed, and it is right that it should, because the middle of that year was not adventure. It was cold. They lived in an old canvas tent that smelled of cats, and they moved it every few days, to a wood in Yorkshire, to a windswept headland, to a frozen riverbank, to a snow-covered clearing where the branches came down white and heavy, and the only sound for hours was the small tick of falling snow. Hermione had brought everything they owned in a beaded handbag no bigger than a fist, and she read endlessly, hunting through Dumbledore's bequests for a clue. Ron listened to the wireless in the dark, waiting for the list of names of the dead to be read out, waiting to not hear his families. Harry kept watch. They ate mushrooms and stolen eggs, and once, memorably, nothing at all for 2 days. They had no plan, only a word, Horcrux, and no method, only hope. And hope wears out faster than boots. And around their necks, in turns, they wore the locket. It was heavy and cold, and it beat like a small second heart against the breastbone. And it fed on whatever was worst in whoever carried it. And it made the tent smaller, and the silence louder, and it whispered. It found Ron's oldest bruise, the belief that he was the least of everyone, the 6th son, the friend of the famous boy, the one nobody chose first, and it pressed on that bruise for weeks, until one gray evening, hungry and hurt, and wearing that thing at his throat, he said things that could not be unsaid, and Hermione cried, and Ron walked out into the rain. And the tent flap closed, and he was gone. And the terrible part, the part nobody tells you, is that he knew within a minute that he had made a mistake, and could not find his way back, because they had moved, as they always moved, and the protective enchantments closed behind them like water. So for weeks, Harry and Hermione were two, and the silence in the tent was a physical thing, and Hermione sat with her back to him for whole days, with her eyes on the same page, and Harry played the wireless low, and thought about the word Ron had used, and the way his face had looked, and neither of them said the name aloud. At Christmas they went to Godric's Hollow. It was snowing there too, and the little village was lit up for the season, and there was a church with a lighted window, and voices singing inside, and the sound of it came across the churchyard into the cold. And they walked among the graves in the dark. They found Kendra and Ariana Dumbledore lying together. They found an old stone marked with a symbol Harry did not understand, a triangle and a circle and a line. And at the end of a row, in the snow, they found a white marble headstone with 2 names on it, James Potter and Lily Potter, and the dates, and how young the dates were. And beneath them a line about the last enemy that would be destroyed, which Harry read wrong at first, and hated, and then, later, understood. He had never in his life stood in the same place as his parents. He had nothing to give them. Hermione conjured a wreath of Christmas roses out of the air, and he laid it down and stood there while the snow came down on his shoulders, and on the stone, and on the names. And he cried, quietly, and there was nobody to see. And then they walked away and left them in the dark. The village nearly killed them. An old woman met them at the gate, Bathilda Bagshot. the great historian, who had known his parents and Dumbledore's family and everyone. And she was not an old woman at all, but a dead thing with Voldemort's snake inside it, and it burst out of her in a stinking coil in an upstairs room, among the dust and the photographs, and they escaped only just, and Harry's wand, the Holly and Phoenix wand that had chosen him at 11, was broken in the flight, snapped almost in two, and Hermione could not mend it, and that loss sat on him all winter like a stone in his chest, worse than hunger, worse than cold. And then, in the deepest part of that winter, in a wood in the forest of Dean, with the snow blue in the moonlight, Harry saw a light moving between the trees, and it was a silver doe. She did not run from him. She was made of light and utterly silent, and she stood and looked at him with her great calm eyes, and he followed her the way you follow something in a dream, through the black trunks and the white ground, and she led him to a frozen pool, and then she dissolved into the air like breath, and at the bottom of that pool, under the ice, lying in the dark water, was the sword of Godric Gryffindor. He broke the ice and went in after it, and the cold took him, and the locket, sensing its death, tightened around his throat and tried to drown him. And he would have died there in 4 feet of water, in a wood in Gloucestershire, and did not, because a pair of hands hauled him out onto the snow, and it was Ron. Ron, who had spent weeks trying to find his way back, who had come to that place because a small silver light in a deluminator had led him to the sound of his own name. He had the sword. He had to be the one to use it, Harry said, and Ron did not want to, because he knew what was inside, and he was right to know. The locket opened. It showed him the thing it had been drinking all winter, the 2 people he loved best, mocking him, telling him he was nothing, telling him he had never been chosen for anything, and it was so exactly the shape of his own fear that he stood frozen in front of it with the sword hanging. And then he swung anyway. That is what courage is, not the absence of the whisper, but the swing after it. The locket screamed and died, and the wood went quiet, and afterwards the 2 of them sat in the snow saying awkward, useless things, and were friends again, and Hermione hit him rather hard when they got back to the tent, and then forgave him, and the tent was 3 again, and warmer. The winter turned. They went to see Xenophilius Lovegood in his strange black tower on a hillside, and he betrayed them because the Death Eaters had taken Luna, and Harry could not even hate him for it. But before that, he read them an old children's story, the tale of the 3 brothers who met death on a bridge and were given 3 gifts: an unbeatable wand, a stone to bring back the dead, a cloak to hide from death himself, and the first 2 brothers came to bad ends, and the third lived to a great age and greeted death like an old friend and went with him as an equal. It was a bedtime story. Every wizarding child knew it, and it was, they slowly realized, also true, or true enough, and the symbol on the grave in Godric's Hollow was the sign of it, and Harry's own cloak, the one that never wore out, was one of the 3, and Voldemort was hunting the wand, and somewhere there was a stone. The Hollows caught Harry like a fever for a while, because they were a way to win, and he was so tired of not winning. They were caught by snatchers in the spring and taken to Malfoy Manor, and this is a hard part, and I will tell it gently and briefly. The peacocks on the lawn, the pale drawing room, the boy Draco who would not say for certain whether the swollen face in front of him was Harry Potter's, because even he had reached the bottom of what he could stomach. Bellatrix Lestrange saw the sword and panicked, because it should have been in her vault, and she sent the boys down to the cellar and kept Hermione, and what happened above their heads in that room, they heard, and could do nothing about, and Ron screamed himself hoarse, and Harry clawed at the walls, and that sound stayed in both of them for the rest of their lives. And in the dark of the cellar, with a piece of broken mirror in his pocket and one blue eye looking back at him, Harry asked for help without knowing whom he was asking, and help came, with a crack, in the form of a small elf with enormous ears and enormous eyes and a shirt he had chosen himself, who had never had a master and never had to come. Dobby brought them out. He took them all, the wand maker and the goblin and the girl and the boys, and he turned on the spot with a hand on Harry's arm, and in the last half-second Bellatrix threw a silver knife across the room. They landed on a beach at Shell Cottage with the sea sounding, and Dobby was dying in Harry's arms, and he had time only to say a name, and he said it, and he was gone. Harry buried him himself, without magic, with a spade, in the sandy soil above the sea, and it took hours, and his hands blistered and bled, and he was glad of it. They wrapped him in Bill's jacket. They marked the grave with a flat stone that Harry scratched a few words into with the point of a broken wand. It was the smallest grave in this whole long story, and it is the one to remember. And somewhere in the middle of that digging, in the ache and the sea wind, the fever left him, and he chose. Not the hollows, the Horcruxes, the slow, hopeless, unglamorous work. He would not go for the wand. He would go for the pieces of the soul, and he would probably lose, and he chose it anyway. So they broke into Gringotts, which is a thing that had never been done, with a goblin named Griphook, and a lock of Bellatrix's hair, and a great deal of luck. Down in the deepest vaults they found an old blind dragon chained under the earth, trained by pain to fear the sound of a rattle, and they cut its chains, and climbed onto its back, and it rose up through the roof of the bank, and out over London and away. And later they let go of it over a lake in the middle of nowhere and swam to shore, and the dragon flew on into the north, free for the first time in 100 years, and I like to think it is out there still. They had the cup of Helga Hufflepuff. And Voldemort, feeling his vault opened, finally understood what they were doing, and his rage went through Harry like a hot wire, and in that rage Harry saw the last piece, and it was at Hogwarts. A lost diadem, a crown that had not been seen in 1,000 years. It was time to go home. They came in through a tunnel from the Hog's Head, where Aberforth Dumbledore, that gruff, bitter old man behind the bar, had been watching over them all year through a fragment of mirror, and the tunnel opened into the room of requirement, and the room was full of children. All of them. Everyone who had stayed and fought that whole terrible year under Snape's headmastership and the Carrows' cruelty. Neville with his face cut about, Ginny, Luna, Seamus, all of them thin and hard and glad. And within an hour the school was awake and the word was out, and the castle was rising. The teachers walked the corridors, sending the youngest ones away through the tunnels. McGonagall brought the suits of armor and the stone statues to life and sent them down the stairs, and she was so happy to be doing it, so fiercely, girlishly happy after all those years, that it made your heart hurt. The ghosts drifted. The house elves came up from the kitchens with knives. The centaurs came out of the forest at last. And around the whole castle the protective enchantments went up like a great dome of light in the night, and outside it, in the dark, the army gathered. The diadem was in the room of requirement, in the great mountainous room of hidden things where 1,000 years of students had stuffed their secrets, and they found it there on the head of an old stone bust in a wig, and they nearly lost everything to fiendfire when Crabbe set the room alight with a curse he could not stop, and the fire took the shape of burning beasts and ate the treasure of a millennium, and they flew out on old broomsticks through the smoke, with Draco Malfoy hanging off the back of Ron's, saved by the boys he had been trying to hand over 5 minutes earlier. Crabbe did not come out. The diadem burned. And then the castle broke, and I will tell you this part softly, because it should not be told any other way. It was not a spectacle. It was a long, loud, shapeless night of people you knew being taken away from you without warning. Fred Weasley died in a corridor laughing at his brother's joke, mid-sentence, with the wall coming down, and Percy would not let go of him. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, who had a baby 7 weeks old asleep at his grandmother's house, died somewhere in the crush, and were found afterwards lying side by side, holding hands, their faces smooth and young and unworried. Colin Creevey, who had been sent away for being too small, sneaked back in and was carried into the Great Hall at dawn, and he was 16 and had never done anything but admire people. 50 of them, in the end. The Great Hall, where they had all eaten their breakfasts for 7 years, became a hospital and then a morgue. The tables pushed back, the enchanted ceiling showing the fading stars, families kneeling on the flagstones in the gray light. In a lull, in the shrieking shack down the hill, Voldemort killed Severus Snape because he believed the Elder Wand needed it, and he did it without cruelty and without interest, the way you turn off a lamp. And Snape, bleeding out on the dusty floor, spent his last strength pulling silver memory out of himself and asking Harry to take it, and looking at him, and looking at his eyes until there was nothing left to look with. Harry took it to the pensieve in the headmaster's office and went down into it, and there he found the story under the story. A thin boy on a playground, watching a red-haired girl. 2 children in the woods before school, before houses, before sides. A friendship broken slowly by a boy's choice of company and pride. A man on a windy hilltop, begging Dumbledore to save one woman and not caring who else died, and being made ashamed of that, and changing, and then spending 16 years as the most hated man in 2 worlds, protecting a boy he could hardly bear to look at, because the boy had his mother's eyes. There was a moment, near the end of it, when Dumbledore asked him whether after all this time he still felt what he had always felt, and Snape's answer was one word, and it was the smallest, plainest word in the language, and it meant always. And it meant that he had never stopped, not once, not for a day, and that everything he had done since he was 20 years old had been done for a woman who had never loved him back, and had been dead since Harry was 1. And in those memories, too, was the thing Dumbledore had never told him. That the night Voldemort's curse rebounded, a piece of his torn soul had broken off and fastened itself to the only living thing in the room. That the connection, the dreams, the language of snakes, all of it was that Harry had been a Horcrux since he was a baby, and that the boy would have to die at Voldemort's hand for the man to be mortal, and that Dumbledore had known it since Harry was 11, and had raised him, and grown fond of him, and let him play Quidditch, and eat sweets, and have friends, all the while keeping him for this. Harry sat on the floor of that office, and understood that he had been walking towards this since he was a year old, and that everything he had done was a long approach to a single quiet act, and the strange thing, the thing he never quite explained to anyone afterwards, is that once he understood it, he was calm. So he walked. He put on the cloak and went down through the wrecked castle, past people he loved carrying stretchers, and did not stop, because if he stopped, he would not go. He saw Ginny in the entrance hall crouched beside a wounded boy and did not speak to her. He walked out across the grounds in the last of the dark, over ground he had crossed 1,000 times, past Hagrid's dark hut, towards the trees. And the snitch was in his hand, the first snitch he ever caught, the one Dumbledore had left him, and he understood at last what to say to it. And he said the plain true thing, that he was about to die, and it opened, and inside it was a small black stone cracked down the middle, and he turned it over 3 times in his fingers. And they came. Not ghosts, not solid, something in between, more real than living people are at 4 in the morning. His mother and his father, and Sirius, and Remus, who had died an hour ago and looked younger than Harry had ever seen him. They walked with him into the forest, and they were not sad, and they were not frightened, and they told him it did not hurt, that it was quicker and easier than falling asleep, and that they had never left, and that they were proud, and that they would stay with him until the very end, and that no one could see them but him. His mother walked at his shoulder and looked at him the way you have wanted all your life to be looked at. And the leaves were black overhead, and the ground was soft, and the forest smelled of cold earth. And he found that he was not afraid, and that dying when you have decided on it, and are loved, is a thing you can do quietly, on your own feet, at 17. He came into the clearing where they were waiting round a fire. He dropped the stone in the leaves. He let the cloak fall. He did not raise his wand, and he did not run, and he looked at the thing that had hunted him his whole life, and let it happen. There was green light. And then he was somewhere very bright and very quiet that looked, when it decided what to look like. Rather a lot like King's Cross Station, empty, clean, full of mist, and he was unhurt and unafraid, and Dumbledore was there, with both hands whole. They talked for a long time on a bench, and I will not repeat it, only tell you what it held, an old man's confession of his own arrogance, his own long-ago hunger for power, the sister he had failed, the boy he had loved and lost to that hunger, his sorrow at what he had asked, his pride, and the fact, said plainly, that the piece of Voldemort in Harry had been the thing that died in that clearing, and that Harry might go on, or might go back, and that it was, entirely and truly, his own choice. Under a bench nearby something small and flayed lay whimpering that could not be helped, and could not be pitied into wholeness, and they let it be. And Dumbledore told him that this was all happening inside his head, and asked, in his last piece of teaching, why on earth that should mean it was not real. He went back. Of course he went back. He lay in the leaves and let Narcissa Malfoy feel his heart beating and lie about it to save her son. He let Hagrid carry his body down to the castle, weeping, which was the worst thing he had to bear that night, worse than dying. He listened to the screaming of everyone he loved when they saw him. And then, it all came apart at once. Neville Longbottom, that round-faced, forgetful boy who had never been good at anything, stood up in front of Voldemort, with a burning hat on his head, and refused, and pulled a silver sword out of the fire, and took the head off the snake in one stroke, and with that the last piece was gone. The castle rose. The centaurs charged, the elves came up from the cellars, the reinforcements poured in from Hogsmeade, and in the great hall in the growing daylight Molly Weasley fought Bellatrix Lestrange for her children's sake, and won. And the last duel was almost nothing at all. 2 men circling in a hall full of people who had stopped fighting to watch, in the first red light of morning, coming through the eastern windows. Harry told him, plainly, what he had done wrong, and what he still might do, offered him the word remorse, which was the only door left open, and it was refused. And then a green curse and a red one crossed in the air, and the Elder Wand, which had never in its long bloody history been loyal to the man who thought he owned it, which had belonged to Dumbledore and been won by a frightened boy on a tower, and won again from that boy by Harry's own hand in a drawing room, turned in the air and would not kill its master, and the killing curse rebounded, and Tom Riddle fell backwards on the flagstones with his arms flung out and died an ordinary death, and the hall was very quiet, and then it was not. The dawn came in properly then, and it was over. And what Harry remembered afterwards was not triumph, but the smell of the great hall, sunlight and dust and blood, the tables put back for people to sit on, house colors forgotten, everyone tangled up together, the Malfoys huddled in a corner uncertain whether they had a right to be there, Creature going round with sandwiches, Fred laid out with his family around him, and Harry so tired that when he finally got upstairs he ate a sandwich, lay down in his old 4-poster in the tower, and slept, and no one woke him. And now the last part, and it is a small one, and it is the reason we came all this way. 19 years later, on the 1st of September, a family walked onto platform 9 3/4 through a haze of steam and owl noise, pushing trolleys. The father was in his late 30s, dark-haired, with a scar on his forehead that nobody stared at anymore. His wife walked beside him, with her hand in the crook of his arm. There was a girl of 11, still too young, pleading to be allowed to go early, and a boy of 14 who already knew everything, and a boy of 11 who was very quiet, because he was afraid he would be sorted into the wrong house and be a disappointment. And his father knelt down on the platform in the steam and told him the plain truth, that he had been named after 2 men, one of them a headmaster and one of them a Slytherin, and that the Slytherin had been the bravest man he had ever known, and that if it mattered so much to him, the hat would take his choice into account, because it had done so once before for a boy on a stool a long time ago who had asked. The whistle blew. Ron and Hermione were there with their own 2, and Neville taught herbology now and would keep an eye out, and Draco Malfoy nodded to them across the platform, a curt small nod, which was more than nothing. The train pulled away, and the children hung out of the windows waving, and the parents stood there in the thinning steam as the scarlet engine curved out of sight, and the platform emptied slowly the way platforms do. Harry raised his hand and lowered it and let the smoke settle, and thought about the boy going north through the fields towards a castle full of ghosts and staircases and candles, and knew he would be all right. The scar had not hurt in 19 years. Nothing hurt. All was well. And you may sleep now. And that's the whole of it. The entire story of Harry Potter, from a baby left on a doorstep in the dark to a tired, happy man on a railway platform, watching his own son disappear into the steam. We went a long way tonight. The cupboard and the letters, the lake and the castle and the enchanted ceiling, a troll, a mirror, a chessboard, a diary that wrote back, a dog that was a man, a cup that was a portkey, a tower, and a wand and a green light, a tent in the snow and a doe in a dark wood, and a boy walking into a forest with the ghosts of everyone who loved him keeping pace at his shoulder. And somewhere in all of that, quietly, without needing to do anything at all, there was you, breathing slower, sinking a little further. Maybe long since gone. You don't have to keep any of it. Let the names go soft. Let the castle blur. Let it all drift out of reach, the way a story does when you've stopped following it and started simply hearing it, the way a voice sounds when you're already half asleep. It was never really about remembering. It was only ever a warm and gentle thing to hold on to while the day let go of you.
And if you want to keep one small piece of it, keep the simplest one. That in the end, after every spell and every prophecy and every clever, terrible plan, the thing that saved him was that he was loved. That was all. His mother's love, and his friends, and the strange, difficult love of an old man who could not always say it. Love was the whole of the magic. You can hold that one softly as you go. So wherever you are right now, whether you're still with me or drifted off somewhere around the third year, let your breathing stay slow and let the dark stay kind. There's nothing left to do tonight, nothing to decide, nothing to be. If these long, slow stories are the ones that get you to sleep, there are more waiting whenever you need somewhere gentle to land. A subscribe keeps them coming. Sleep well now. Sleep deeply. The castle will still be there, and the story will keep, and everything else can wait for morning. Thank you for spending this night with me. And if you've been asleep for hours, well then, this last part was only for the quiet. Good night. Sweet dreams. All is well.